Good morning. Welcome to the 9th Native Prairie Restoration Reclamation Workshop. I am Carolyn Gadet, the manager of the Saskatchewan Prairie Conservation Action Plan, or PCAP. I'm also the chair of the planning committee for the workshop. I'd like to start by stating that we respectfully acknowledge that we are on the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations and communities, past and present. I am currently in Regina in Treaty 4 territory, which includes the territory of the Niuaque, Anishinaabe, Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota, and the homeland of the Métis or Michif Nation. For a millennia, they have worked to protect these landscapes and the life that these areas sustain. I would like to thank these original caretakers and acknowledge the ongoing work and presence of Indigenous peoples in Canada today. So this is the second time that we've hosted this workshop virtually. We are really excited that we were able to add an extra workshop to our regular schedule while everyone stays safe during the continuation of this pandemic. I know there was a time in the fall when individuals may have been questioning why we were doing it virtually since case studies were decreasing. And then Omicron happened, so I'm glad that we assumed the worst last spring and we didn't have to pivot in the last month. We're also really hoping that this is our last virtual NPRRW and that we can meet in person next time. The Native Prairie Restoration Reclamation Workshop would not be possible without the long-term support of our platinum sponsors, Trace Associates and the Mosaic Company. We are so grateful to all of our gold sponsors, CN, Crescent Point Energy, the Eastern Irrigation District, Enbridge, Environment and Climate Change Canada, the Canadian Wildlife Service, the Faculty of Science at the University of Regina, and North American Helium. Our silver sponsors for this event are Brett Young and Nutrien. I would also like to thank our bronze sponsors, which are Tanis Conservation Services and Truex Company, and our participant sponsors, iWhitson Innovations Inc. and Society for Range Management, the Prairie Parkland chapter. I'd also like to thank our planning committee for their hard work over the last year. They volunteer their work and personal time for this event, and we always appreciate their feedback and ideas. I would also like to especially thank Caitlin Moreau-Seiler, who is the stewardship coordinator at PCAP, and she's been instrumental at helping pull this workshop together. And a big thank you to our presenters and our case study leaders for their contributions and support. There's more involved in participating in a virtual workshop. There's practice sessions and dealing with IT issues and figuring out how to deliver a case study virtually. So we really appreciate their patience and cooperation. We also appreciate all the support from our attendees. We have over 220 individuals registered for this week who are from BC to Quebec to Texas, some of which are first-time attendees to our workshop, so welcome. We hope you enjoy it. Over the next 3 days, you will have access to 9 webinars and a choice of 8 case studies or discussion groups. All the presentations will be recorded and will be available on the Feedloop platform for at least 6 months. So you are more than welcome to come back and rewatch a good presentation or watch those that you've missed. The case study presentations will also be recorded, but we won't record the breakout groups. So you should be able to watch the recorded presentation and download the handouts or activities and do the case study on your own time if you've missed any. I would also like to encourage you to make the most of the networking experiences. There's the poster session and the trade show, which occur at noon every day and from 9 to 9:30 every morning. Virtual events are similar to in-person events in the way that you get out of them what you put in. So it might take more effort to visit a poster or a trade show booth and start talking to people because you can't really see them. And participate in a virtual case study, but you'll end up getting more out of it in the end. So in addition to participating, we also want you to or encourage you to explore our virtual event. So we have gamification codes hidden throughout the virtual platform. You might have to talk to poster presenters or exhibitors to get the codes, or they may be hidden in random places. And then you can redeem the points for prizes. You just check the gamification tab in the dashboard. I would also like to remind everyone to download our event program from the PCAP website. There's also a link to the event program in the lobby. This includes a detailed schedule for the week, so the presentations and case studies, greetings from our sponsors, and more. And as you learn to navigate this virtual platform, I encourage you to use our tutorial video and attendee guide. There's links for both of those in the lobby. If you're experiencing IT issues, you can always try to leave and come back. You think I'm kidding, but it works sometimes. So you can try that. You can also check the help tab in the dashboard if that doesn't work, or there's a few troubleshooting tips in the attendee guide. So before I hand it over to our first speaker, I just wanted to let you know that you can choose to have the presentation full screen, or you can minimize the public chat that's on the right of your screen, or the sessions and the dashboard that's on the left, or any combination of those that suits you. This is a webinar. You are muted and we can't see you, but you can type in questions at any time in this Zoom box. So you're on the FeedLoop page and Zoom is embedded in FeedLoop. So make sure that you put your questions in the Zoom Q&A and not the FeedLoop Q&A. So the speakers will only be answering questions at the end of their presentations if they're entered in the Zoom Q&A spot. Also, if you have general comments about the session or workshop or any networking comments, those can be put in the public chat on FeedLoop that's on the right side of your screen. But again, to reiterate, the public group chat and the Q&A box in your FeedLoop screen will not be moderated during the presentations. There was some confusion last year, so I just wanted to make sure that was clear. So now that all those housekeeping things are out of the way, we can get started. This morning's session is all about soil. Soil is so important and it's often overlooked, but it's really the foundation of any restoration project. We will start this morning with Dr. Melissa Arcand. Melissa is a soil scientist from the Muskeg Lake Cree Nation, where she grew up on a grain farm. She is also an associate professor in the Department of Soil Science at the University of Saskatchewan. Her research focuses on soil health, carbon storage, and nutrient cycling in agro-ecosystems, and has been collaborating with First Nations to assess soils on agricultural lands. She teaches and is the academic advisor for students in the Ganaway Titan Eski program, designed to train students to work in resource management and land governance in Indigenous communities across Canada. So I'm so glad we're able to have you speak today, Melissa. If you wanted to share your screen.
All right, you can see that?
Yes.
Great. Okay, well, thank you, Carolyn, for the introduction, and also thank you for inviting me to participate in this workshop. As Carolyn said, I'm a soil scientist, and I'm also from Muskeg Lake Cree Nation in Treaty 6 territory, and I'm actually sitting today in Saskatchewan, which is also in Treaty 6 territory. And so today I'm going to share some ongoing work that I've been doing in collaboration and partnership with a number of First Nations communities within Saskatchewan, as well as some environmental NGOs in relation to, especially in relation to looking at strategies for climate change mitigation within the context of First Nations land management. So I really liked the theme of the workshop, restoration, reclamation, and resilience. And I wanted to add this, I guess, 4R, this fourth R, which is relationships. And again, I'm going to hopefully emphasize the importance of relationships in terms of land stewardship and with respect to restoration and land management. So as I'm sure I'm speaking to the choir when I say that grassland resilience to climate change and other stressors is really reliant on diversity and, again, relationships. And I mean, diversity at all scales, right? So as a soil scientist, I'm very much interested in how a soil microbial community can facilitate soil organic matter formation and carbon sequestration in our soils. But we're also thinking about, well, how does landscape diversity, especially in the prairies, where we do have, obviously much limited, I guess, access to what would have been native prairie, the importance of diversification and landscape diversification for improving the overall health and resilience of our agricultural systems. And as Carolyn had mentioned in my introduction, most of my research has historically been in cropping systems, and I haven't historically done very much work at all sort of within natural or grasslands or restoration. But I want to sort of describe the story, I suppose, of how I've now kind of arrived at needing to do this work, and through sort of the progression of the work that I've been doing with a number of First Nations communities within the province. And so hopefully I can sort of walk you through sort of how does someone come from a cropping systems perspective to value the importance of grassland restoration. And so I'm really going to focus my talk kind of within this context of climate change, and especially this concept of natural climate solutions. So back in the during the Paris Agreement, Canada committed to reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. And this was also reaffirmed in the COP26 conference that happened just this past fall in Glasgow. And of course, much of the greenhouse gas reductions need to come from reductions in fossil fuel use. But there is a potential for changes in land management and using natural climate solutions to also contribute to reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, which also can coincide with increases in carbon sequestration within lands that we manage and that we occupy. So as a soil scientist, I'm definitely very, excited about the career that I have in the future, given the fact that soils have a major role to play in facilitating many natural climate solutions. And I'm sure, as many of you know, soils represent a significant carbon sink. And that's because soils constitute the largest terrestrial pool of carbon. So soils can contain more carbon than both the atmosphere and vegetation combined. And so as a result, a really small increase in net soil carbon storage can represent a significant carbon sink potential. But on the flip side, any disruption of soil organic matter that can increase rates of decomposition, which would result in the release of carbon dioxide from our soils, that can also be a significant impact. So a big driver of potential CO2 emissions from soils is land use conversion. So such as the conversion of native grassland to cropland can result in significant losses of carbon. And we know this historically. There's been a lot of research that has shown this, that there has been major losses of carbon when native prairie was broken for crop production. And in the last 30 years or so, with the implementation of no-till, we've reversed that trend, but certainly not able to achieve the same levels of soil organic matter content in annual cropping systems compared to native grasslands. So the balance of carbon in our soils, it really depends on the balance of inputs from organic materials, so primarily from plant litter, and of course in native grasslands and in perennial ecosystems, or like pastures and other lands that contain perennial plants. It's those roots that are really critical in being able to input carbon into the soil through root exudation, through root turnover. That sort of constant contact of root systems with the soil is really critical to providing that supply, providing that input of carbon. And again, sort of getting back to this idea of relationship and diversity, it's also that relationship between those plant roots and the soil microbial community that's also incredibly important in terms of how that carbon, once it is released into the soil, actually is able to persist within the soil. So in the last 10 years or so, we've learned a lot more about how soil organic matter is formed and about how carbon can actually stay within the soil. And it has a lot to do with the way in which the microbial community processes and metabolizes those plant carbons, so the root exudates, how the microbial community process those root exudates, and how the microbial byproducts and as well as the microbial necromass actually can be stabilized with the mineral matrix of the soil. So we've got some really major increases in our knowledge about how soil organic matter and how soil carbon can actually persist in the soil. So it's exciting times, and a lot of that is reliant on an understanding of plant and microbial relationships. So of course, compared to annual cropland, grassland soils are especially important in acting as a carbon sink. And so wanting to understand how we can protect grasslands to protect that carbon sink is really important. Now, I mentioned before that I predominantly work in cropping systems. And so I want to start by talking about sort of this notion of climate smart soils. So in the last few years, many soil scientists who are working in sort of the agricultural space and looking at carbon, looking at greenhouse gas emissions, we focus a lot of our research on examining natural climate solutions that are aimed at managing soils for increased carbon persistence, but that can also support other ecosystem services. Of course, the big one is food production, but also other important services like habitat conservation, water quality, and biodiversity. So within the context of a sort of annual cropping system, one of the biggest strategies, that is being talked about more and more is diversifying rather than diversifying our agricultural landscapes to include perennial vegetation. So whether or not that is restoring marginal croplands to forage or restoring riparian grasslands, so around wetlands, planting shelter belts. There's a lot of benefits both to soil carbon storage, but also to other ecosystem benefits like habitat, and biodiversity. But I did want to point out that there is this sort of thought about, well, how can we better perennialize our annual cropping systems? How can we take advantage of perennial vegetation in places within, those field margins that might not be as productive? And can we work towards maybe taking a small part of a field out of annual crop production for these other to foster these other ecosystem benefits? Now, in terms of these natural climate solutions, Of course, grassland soils are really critical to climate change mitigation. Again, I'm probably speaking to the choir here, but a recent study that was just published last year by Drever et al., looking at a variety of different natural climate solutions for Canada, they actually found that protecting grasslands, so avoiding grassland conversion, was the #1 nature-based or natural climate solution out of all of the solutions that they studied that could be implemented in agricultural lands and in grasslands. So protecting grasslands from conversion will absolutely protect soil carbon stocks. We're not disrupting the soil, and we're also ensuring that there is a constant plant community that is in contact with the soil. And so within this study, they projected that avoiding grassland conversion could sequester 12.7 megatons of carbon dioxide equivalents per year, and that preventing conversion and the way that this would be achieved would be preventing conversion of 2.5 million hectares per year of native grasslands across the prairie provinces, as well as conversion of managed pasture between now and 2030. And again, as I mentioned, so this figure here is from the Drever et al. Paper. And so each one of these bars indicates the climate change mitigation potential projected out to 2030. And each of the different colors or the shades represents the costs of the mitigation strategy. So some of these, in order to achieve that level of mitigation, it could potentially cost more. But nevertheless, as I mentioned, avoided grassland conversion is one of those natural climate solutions that was shown to have the greatest potential. But you can also see that there is a massive error bar here. There's a lot of uncertainty as well, that sort of as part of these estimates. But again, it does reveal the importance of avoiding grassland conversion to ensure that those carbon stocks that took thousands of years to build up and to reach an equilibrium is actually protected. So I wanted to lay a little bit of that out off the hop, and then I'm going to switch gears to talk about the role that Indigenous people play and are affected by climate change, and then focus on some of the recent work that we've been doing as a collaborative group. So with respect to Indigenous people and climate change, just sort of on a more general scale, is that oftentimes Indigenous peoples and communities are on the front lines of climate change, whether that means being sort of the first to be impacted by wildfires, by floods, by habitat decline, by reductions in access to food, and especially to traditional food sources, as well as the impacts of increases in forest pests and potentially other invasive species. And so in spite of that, the detriment and sort of that disproportionate impact facing many Indigenous communities who are living on the land or really close to areas that are more vulnerable to climate change, First Nations also have a role to play in climate change mitigation through land stewardship, because First Nations communities do hold lands that offer sort of potential for employing some of these nature-based or natural climate solutions. Now, focusing in more directly on First Nations, and I'm going to talk more specifically sort of within the context of the prairies, and especially in Saskatchewan, is that so there are 74 First Nations communities in Saskatchewan. There's probably about 59 First Nations communities that are located within the agricultural region, so south of the boreal forests and the grasslands and the parkland region. But we have really limited data compared to other jurisdictions on carbon stocks on First Nations reserve lands, but especially limited understanding of what the socioeconomic drivers as well as barriers might be for adopting natural climate solutions. And then there's also this important point to acknowledge that because of the disruption of Indigenous knowledge through settlement, through colonialism, and especially through disconnection of Indigenous people to language, culture, and the land, that there has been, a decline in Indigenous knowledge of prairie ecology. Just like we've seen a decline in native grasslands themselves, that's coincided with a decline in sort of the overall population's understanding of our traditional knowledge, including the knowledge that's built into our language systems. So there's a lot of challenges and a lot of uncertainties when we think about what might be the potential for our lands to provide, these ecosystem services such as carbon sequestration, habitat, and biodiversity. So, what did our landscapes, look like prior to European settlement? How does this kind of relate back to soils again? So I'm sure, everyone here is very well aware that the soils in the agricultural region of the Prairie provinces were developed under those native grasslands, those grasslands that were diverse, that were grazed, by multiple different grazing species, but including the bison. And of course, there was also people who lived in these landscapes who interacted with these grasslands and also participated in a really intentional way in that interaction. And over, millennia, the soils within these lands developed very rich, were rich in organic matter, rich in fertility, and essentially offered the settlers who then arrived to break those native prairies for farmland, this very rich bank of fertility, this rich bank of organic matter. But these soils as well, not only the soils that developed under grassland ecosystems were rich in fertility, but they also still hold a lot of our history. The history of glaciation, the history of grassland development, but also the history of settlement across the plains. And so I'm going to walk you all through what some of this history might tell us about the potential for land management decisions, for land use and land use change, and how that might impact the potential for carbon storage, especially within First Nations lands within the Prairie provinces. So here is a satellite image of the southern part of Saskatchewan. So Saskatoon and Regina are easily displayed here. And what I want to point out is the fact that through our past, through the last 150 years of settlement, of colonization, this has actually had a noticeable impact on the lands that First Nations hold or occupy and hold. And what I want to point out is if we start in the southeast and we work our way northwest and we sort of follow along, that transition between the mixed moist grassland and the prairie parkland, or in the parkland, Aspen parkland, that's where most of the First Nations communities within Saskatchewan are actually located. We don't really have very many communities sort of in that Palliser triangle, but more so towards the Aspen parkland region. But what I want to point out is that if you look really closely, there are little green postage stamps kind of scattered through that southeast to northwest band. And that's where many First Nations communities are actually located. So if you can see, I'm just pulling up the boundaries of all of the First Nations communities within this location of Saskatchewan. And you can start to see that, you know, they do sort of stand out against the developed farmland in the neighboring rural municipalities. And so there's I guess a couple of points to make about that. One, what we see is certainly there seems to be a higher dominance of perennial vegetation. There's more bushland, potentially more grassland. These lands are probably already doing a lot in terms of offering habitat, offering up biodiversity, and also improvements on, or differences, increases in say carbon sequestration relative to the agricultural lands in the neighboring rural municipalities. So that's, you know, that's sort of like the optimistic view that we can take when we look at these satellite images where these First Nations lands sort of pop out. And if we look a little bit more closely, just taking some data from land use cover data. So I've got these two panels, these two maps. On the left is sort of the northwest part of just north of Saskatoon, north and west of Saskatoon, and then the southeast, just as examples. And so we just pulled out different land uses that are land covers within both of these regions. And so you can start to see, well, what are those green postage stamps actually sort of comprised of? And so we see a lot of treed areas, forest. So in the southeast here, lots of forest. But then we also see that there's quite a bit of grassland, as well as quite a bit of pasture and forage and shrubland. So indeed, you know, there's a diversity of different land cover types that are represented within First Nations lands. And again, they sort of pop out against the more, I guess, monotone cropland in the neighboring rural municipalities. And so next I'm going to talk about, well, why might that be? There's a lot of complicated historical reasons for why this might be, and I'm going to kind of walk you through that history. So first of all, we got to go back to the treaty, signing of the treaty. So Treaty 4 in the south was signed in 1874, and Treaty 6 was signed more towards the north 2 years later in 1876. And in both Treaty 4 and Treaty 6, agriculture was a really central feature in the negotiations between the Indigenous leaders and the Crown representatives. And when we talk about reserve land, First Nations reserve land specifically, I want to pull out this excerpt. This is a direct excerpt from Treaty 6. And so it says here, and Her Majesty the Queen hereby agrees and undertakes to lay aside reserves for farming lands, due respect being had to lands at present cultivated by the said Indians. And so what this excerpt tells us is two things. The first thing is that the land that was supposed to be delineated for reserves was meant to be for farmland. It wasn't meant to be the sole location where First Nations people were meant to reside. The intention was that First Nation would still be able to freely move off the reserve lands to be able to access other areas, other parts of their traditional territory for hunting, for ceremony, for meeting with family, for trading, because most First Nations communities would not have been sedentary in one location. They would have had, you know, like a winter location, there would have been a summer location, and movement in between. And so the reserves are really meant to be established for farmlands. The other point that comes across within this, this excerpt is that it says, due respect being had to lands at present cultivated by the said Indians. And so what this says is that there were already Indigenous people that had already taken up, you know, European style farming in 1876. So people had already started to make some to start to adapt to the new ecology and the new economy of the plains. But by this point, the bison populations had already started to be decimated. Essentially, there was major need to be able to gain a stable food source, and so Indigenous people had started to make some of those adaptations, which some of that included taking up farming. Now, in the early days, First Nations farmers were initially quite successful in agriculture in those sort of late 1800s, early 1900s, and there's a lot of historical documentation that demonstrates this. But we also know that in the starting from again the early 1900s and even leading to present day, there were many government policies and actions that were implemented that systematically undermined Indigenous people's success in agriculture. So these are really specific things like the peasant farm policy, which prevented First Nations or Indigenous farmers from purchasing new farm equipment. There was the pass and permit system. So the permit system required Indigenous farmers to hold a permit that was signed by the Indian agent that would allow them to sell their produce. So if they were trying to sell hay or bushel of wheat or any livestock, they would need a signed permit. And the pass system required Indigenous people to have a signed pass by the Indian agent to be able to leave the reserve. So there were many, and I could go on and on, but essentially there's many policies that undermined Indigenous people's success in the agricultural industry, which then led to declines in Indigenous participation in the agricultural sector. So fewer farmers, and even to present day, First Nations farmers only comprise about 0.4% of the farm population in Saskatchewan, in spite of the fact that we comprise 11% of the overall population. So there was major declines in the number of Indigenous people who were farming and who understood and had a good working knowledge of how farm operations worked. But at the same time that First Nations farmers were being undermined, First Nations reserve lands were also being undermined and marginalized for a variety of reasons. So number one, the land bases that should have been surveyed as part of the initial establishment of the reserves were oftentimes much smaller than what they should have been based on the treaty negotiations. And this has actually been, shown in the court systems. This is what has resulted in the treaty land entitlement framework agreement that was signed between 25 First Nations communities in Saskatchewan, the Saskatchewan provincial government, and the federal government back in 1992. So this is an established, resolved, well, more or less resolved fact. But the other thing that happened that people don't know about, as much as I know about treaty land entitlement, is that there is a large number of reserve lands across the Prairie provinces that were surrendered for sale by the Crown, many of which happened from 1905 to 1930. And a lot of these lands were sold to the Crown so that for expansion of the railway. But a big reason for a lot of these land surrenders was actually associated with the Soldier Settlement Act, whereby the Crown needed land to be able to give to returning World War I and World War II veterans. And so in total across Saskatchewan, I believe it's about 250,000 acres that were surrendered for sale by the Crown. Now I'm going to make this point and get back to soils here. So what I'm showing here are two aerial satellite images of Mistawassis, Nehewak, and Muskeg Lake Cree Nation. So I'm from Muskeg Lake, and Mistawassis is our neighboring community just to the north of us. And then the two maps on the right are the original soil maps that were surveyed back in the 1960s. So most First Nations communities in the agricultural region had their soil surveyed in the 1960s as part of the broader scale effort of the Saskatchewan Institute of Pedology to classify and map out Saskatchewan soils. And so what we have here, so the boundaries in red in the satellite image is the same boundaries that we see in the soil map to the right. And so both of our communities, both Mestawasis and Muskeg Lake, had lands that were sold to the Canadian government back in 1917 and 1919. And most recently, through the court systems and through the specific claims process, those land surrenders were actually shown to breach the Crown's fiduciary duty to the communities. And so we've respectively, both communities have recently been successful in demonstrating that that was the case. But one of the things that I want to point out here is, so we've got our soil map that I'm showing here, and you can see the land base in the 1960s, which coincided with those soil maps. And instead of, so each of the polygons indicates agricultural land capability, the capability classes. And so what I want to show you and demonstrate is that it was no coincidence which parcels of land were surrendered for sale. I'm going to show you what the original land base was. So you can see that for both communities, so Mestawasis, they lost all of their Class 1 land, a good proportion of Class 2 and Class 3 land, and Muskeg Lake lost all of their Class 1 land and a high proportion of their Class 2 land. And so, of course, what this has meant is that after those land surrenders, we had less high quality land to be able to engage in annual crop production. And so, yeah, farming on more marginal land, we had fewer farmers because of all of these barriers that were in place. And what over time, over decades, what this meant is that in present day, we have a really low number of Indigenous farmers within any given community. And yet we still have quite a bit of agricultural land. And so now most agricultural production on First Nations lands is dominated by non-Indigenous farmers. Definitely over 90% would be farmed by non-Indigenous producers. And so this would be both grain producers, but also cattle producers. Now we've got fewer Indigenous farmers, but we also, because of treaty land entitlement and because of specific claims, we've actually expanded our reserve land base because we're able to purchase land. And so many communities have purchased land over the last 20 years and still will purchase land, and they're looking to purchase land that could be used for agricultural production, for both grain production, but as well as grazing land. And some of the things that we've been learning through the collaborative work that we've been doing is that in large part on lands that are higher quality, much of the agricultural production is exactly the same. The practices are the same, more or less. But what we're actually seeing is a more dynamic changes and nuances on those more marginal lands. So we're seeing a relatively high conversion of marginal land that would have been under perennial vegetation. Perhaps it used to be pasture land, but because we've had declines of First Nations ranchers as well, some of those lands have been abandoned. And in recent years, those lands have been converted to annual crop production, and we see major soil degradation with that conversion. And of course, losses, the coincident loss of carbon from those soils as well. But that said, working with land managers and working with communities who are also in partnership with other with NGOs, so not just university researchers like myself, but other environmental NGOs, to look at how those lands might be restored. So there's a desire and a recognition of importance to restore those marginal lands. And this isn't unique to one community. This is, relatively common across Saskatchewan. And so some of this knowledge or some of this insight has come about through a really recent project that has been done in collaboration, currently being led by Mr. Lesses Nehewak, and in partnership with Muskeg Lake Cree Nation, and then NGOs including the North Saskatchewan River Basin Council, the Red Berry Lake Biosphere Reserve, the Saskatchewan Aboriginal Lands Technicians, and then a couple of researchers, myself and Christine Morrissey from the University of Saskatchewan. And this is part of the Living Labs, Agriculture, Agri-Food Canada, Agricultural Climate Solutions, Living Labs proposal development. And we were successful in the first phase. And so we're able to do some of this work, even if we don't get the Living Lab application. We've already been able to put in a lot of, I guess, work in place to understand what some of the nuances are in terms of the potentials for nature-based climate solutions that might have the most impact within First Nations communities. But one thing that has been incredibly central to this work so far is that collaboration, that relationship building, because each organization comes with, comes with skills and a knowledge base, but any one of us, any one of our organizations working alone would not have been able to kind of unravel what some of these complexities are. A major one is really re-looking at some of these lease agreements that have historically been really imbalanced between the non-Indigenous farmer who's leasing the land and the First Nations community who holds the land, who's the landlord. But really, historically, those relationships has been very transactional, sometimes very inequitable. And a lot of what we've been doing with this work is re-engaging and reaffirming relationship between the farmer and the First Nations community to understand, well, what are the decisions that are being made and why are those decisions being made in terms of land management, in terms of land use conversion. And so to understand those nuances is the first thing to do before we can actually be able to implement anything on the land itself. So we're really looking at how can we reimagine these lease agreements as promises to each other and the land, and not just simply transactional. So again, really wanting to work together to restore relationship to land and each other. And I had mentioned before that, the loss of our native prairie ecosystems has been coincident with the loss of Indigenous culture as well and language. And so there's been a huge push to revitalize language, land-based learning. There's many communities within Saskatchewan who are now returning bison to their communities. And part of that restoration, part of the restoration of these ecosystems means restoring a relationship with each other and with with our relatives like the bison and the plants and all of the other animals that are occupying these ecosystems. And recognizing these diverse knowledge systems is really critical to understand how we can work together. And so I really like this quote that Anthony Johnson, who's the lead from Mr. Nehewak, working together for a shared good future is something that he often says. But at the end of the day, talking with First Nations land managers across the province, it always comes back to the relationship to the land, to our role as stewards of the land. And so I really like all these quotes that have been shared with me over the years in working with First Nations lands managers. The land is everything, our teacher, our mother. So with that, I will, I'll stop here, and I'd really like to acknowledge all of the individuals from the University of Saskatchewan, from First Nations communities, especially Muskeg Lake, Mistawassis, and Cowessess First Nations, as well as the individuals from the NGOs that I had just mentioned, because it really has been a collaborative work environment. So with that, I'll thank you all for your attention, and I will take questions if there are any.
Thanks, Melissa. That was great. So if anyone has any questions, you can type it into the Q&A box that's in the Zoom box. We'll just wait for some questions to come in. The first one is from John, and he says, Melissa, you mentioned a figure at the outset about the amount of carbon stored in soils. Could you mention that again, please?
Yeah, let me just bring up that slide. Just a second. Share my screen again. And these are estimates. Sorry. Of course, now it's gonna. Never quick when you're in the hot seat. Okay, so here is one sort of piece of data that talked about the conversion when land is converted, how much carbon can be lost. So anywhere between 0.5 to 2 megagrams, which would be tons basically of carbon per hectare per year. So I'm not sure exactly, probably didn't quite maybe answer your question there, but sorry, trying to navigate all of these. I can't see the chat.
Like the question?
Yeah, I can't see the chat without stopping my, oh, here we go.
Oh. Do you want me to ask the question again?
Yeah, no, I got it. Oh yeah, so he said, how does that compare? How does the amount of carbon that is in the soil compare with carbon stored elsewhere in the air and above ground vegetation? So it's about like the amount of carbon that's stored in the soil is more than both the air and the above ground vegetation. There's, yeah, I guess there's a few research articles that that have pulled that together actually to give some better numbers on that. So if anyone's familiar with Henry Jansen's work, he has written about this quite a bit. Let me just find. Where is it? Sorry, I'm probably taking up, I probably don't need to do this right now. But yeah, so Henry Jansen, retired Agriculture Agri-Food Canada researcher from Lethbridge, he talks about this a lot. And so here in this figure, he indicates how much carbon is in the atmosphere, how much carbon is in above ground vegetation, and then how much carbon is stored in the top 1 meter of soil. So you can see these are, again, these are aggregated across, on a global scale. So there's a lot of, uncertainty around there, but roughly, add these two numbers up and it's less than what's stored in that top meter of soil. So sort of on that global scale. Hopefully that provides a bit more specific answer for you.
Okay, thank you. We have a few more minutes for questions if anyone wanted to type them in. Melissa, you had talked about how there's like limited data on drivers and barriers to using like natural climate solutions. There's some that are known to exist, right? Like, do you have like examples that you can
share?
Sure.
So one of the, I guess, yeah, one of those examples is that, so a lot of First Nations will enter into like a term lease agreement with a farmer, and so the length of the lease can vary, but often what's super common is like a 3-year lease. And so the farmers are, within a 3-year lease, they're not guaranteed to have that lease renewed. And so if they're going to implement any practice on that piece of land that might have, long-term benefit, but might have a little bit more of a higher sort of implementation cost, they're going to be dissuaded from doing that because they might not see that benefit for themselves, especially if they don't renew the lease and another farmer takes, is able to farm that land. So that's a really big barrier, actually, is that the lease length can really be a disincentive to implementing any of long-term practices that could have benefits. Okay, so Jessica Larson, what practices are being done on Indigenous lands that takes traditional knowledge into play when it comes to improving soil? Well, honestly, I think probably the most obvious example here is the idea of intercropping. So intercropping or permaculture, those things have intercropping kind of on a larger scale and permaculture on a smaller scale have really taken hold, in terms of an idea. And those are really Indigenous farm practices that came out of, farming in the South and farming in the East. So those are some practices, but again, that's sort of like nurturing that diversity, like plant diversity, and then being able to, because of that plant diversity, are able to provide a diversity of functions as well. So there's a question about First Nations in the southeast of Saskatchewan maintaining some of the more extensive prairie pieces. Wondering if you have any thoughts on how we might begin to instill the land respect as you have shared in settler culture. Yeah, that's a really, really big question. And, obviously one that is going to take a lot of work for people to tackle. I mean, honestly, the easiest, but the hardest, both the easiest and the hardest thing is actually talking to your neighbor and visiting, and not just visiting your neighbor, but visiting the land that they value, so you can understand where that value is coming from. But of course, that takes a lot of work, So yeah, that's a really important question though. May is asking if there's First Nations to learn from regenerative agriculture movement, including sort of holistic ecosystem-oriented practices. Yeah, absolutely. And I think part of the work that we're doing is going to be hopefully partnering with practitioners who do have expertise in regenerative ag, which would include also more integration of livestock and annual cropping. Karen says, it is exciting to see the collaboration on Indigenous lands have marginal lands placed back into perennial forage. Do you see timelines associated with when this conversion will occur? I think it's going to be really varied. I know there's some communities that are already partnering with organizations such as Ducks Unlimited, who are, sort of already implementing some of these things, but others, it's even just not even aware that either programs exist or that could be this potential. So I think it's going to really, in some cases, like I said, right now it's happening. In other cases, it might take, another decade or more. So
I think we have time for one more question if you wanted to do the last one.
So the last question is, do undisturbed prairie soils act as a carbon store or as a sink? So are they able to store? Is the potential for carbon sequestration in restoring permanent veg on disturbed land? Yeah, there would be definitely potential for carbon sequestration if you're restoring permanent veg on disturbed land, simply because on disturbed land you're likely already kind of at a lower sort of lower potential of what's there, so it could be built up. And again, like I said before, by having permanent veg perennials, you are going to have, it's that, again, that balance between inputs and outputs, right? So if you're increasing the number of inputs by increasing the amount of plant cover you have, you're very likely to increase the amount of carbon that's on that land, as long as it's not continuously being disturbed, right? Because if you keep disturbing it, you're going to increase the potential for decomposition and losses of carbon as carbon dioxide. But yeah, there's a lot of, I guess, more research and understanding, well, how does that carbon actually stay in the soil once it's down there? And I think there's good opportunity, especially in these perennial systems where you've got these deeper rooting systems that allow that carbon to be stored at depth in a much more stable way than in annual cropping systems where you've got A, more disturbance, and B, you don't have as deep rooting systems. So I'll end there because I'm cognizant of the time. But yeah, thanks for those questions.
Yeah, thank you. That was awesome. So now we have a 5-minute break. So we'll be back at 10:35 with Stephen's presentation. So okay, welcome back. I hope you all had a good little bio break. It was something that came up in the evaluations a lot last year because we didn't include them. So we have them every hour now. So I hope you enjoy. So next up, we have Stephen Siciliano. Stephen is a soil microbiologist and toxicologist with 25 years of experience in industrial innovation and academic research. He has led soil remediation work of hydrocarbons, metal, and fertilizers across the globe, spanning both Antarctica and the Arctic, with a strong emphasis on the remediation of hydrocarbons in difficult northern soils that have complex below-ground infrastructure. So welcome, Stephen. Did you want to share your screen?
Sure thing. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. You can see that okay?
Yes.
Excellent. Well, good morning, everybody. Thanks for taking time to listen to me today. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about stimulating and tracking natural source zone depletion. And today I'm going to be talking, you're going to hear me talk a little bit about environmental material science. And this is a commercialization vehicle that we created to help commercialize the technology that we've developed in collaboration with Federated Co-op. So over the last 10 or 15 years, Federated Co-op and I have been working together to develop technologies that are well suited to Saskatchewan, Alberta, and Manitoba soils that allow them to sustainably remediate and manage contaminated sites of all sorts. And one of the key scientific aspects of that I'm going to focus today's talk about are, well, over the course of that time, we've developed 3 different technologies: a soil sense, an optimizer, distributor. But today I'm going to really talk about the soil sense. I'm going to give you the scientific background of what it's based on and how it's used. And one of the things to think about is we're going to call this natural source zone depletion. As a soil scientist, I often think of natural source zone depletion as soil health, but really soil health not linked directly to agricultural productivity or rangeland management, but in this case, about management of contaminated sites. I don't think I've been doing a lot of brainstorming with Eric Lamb about how we could use much of this same technology to help manage rangeland and burning practices to optimize prairie soil health. But that'll be a talk we haven't figured out how to do it yet. So maybe that's a talk for future years after me and Eric have run some trials and figured out how we can use this. But today we're going to focus on hydrocarbon remediation. And when we talk about that, we talk about natural source zone depletion. And how natural source zone depletion is this recognition that the vast majority of hydrocarbons in a soil, which is depicted here, the vast majority of hydrocarbons being remediated are actually being remediated by methanogenesis. And the reason for that is that as microbes deplete readily available nitrate and sulfate, methanogens start taking over and they start generating a tremendous amount of methane. That methane bubbles up through the soil profile where it starts to encounter oxygen and methanotrophs, which are, I'm not sure everybody knows this, but soils are the world's largest sink of methane. So aerobic soils are the dominant methane sink in the biosphere. And so we take advantage of that. We say, all right, look, they're going to take up this methane that was generated from hydrocarbon degradation. They're going to mix, the methanotrophs will then use oxygen as an electron acceptor and producing CO2. And then that CO2 continues to go up to the surface. And so what we can do is by tracking the gradient, this would be, there's various ways to do this, but this I think is the easiest, is we can take advantage of Fick's first law, which simply is diffusion. Fick's first law, which sounds fancy, is just how things diffuse. And what we can do is by placing soil sensors at various depths in the soil, what we can do is we can then estimate the profiles of oxygen, CO2, methane, and then based off that, we can calculate how much hydrocarbon is degrading, or basically what is the microbial activity occurring in deep subsurface. Most of our sites here are going to be, 2 to 5 meters deep. So we're not talking 30 centimeters of soil that often we think about in an ag or rangeland system. We're really talking about the very base of the B horizon and well into the C horizon. So how do we do this? It's actually not that complicated. So here's a hypothetical profile in which we're seeing CO2 on the x-axis. And so it can really be anything, by the way, oxygen, CO2, or methane. We're doing CO2 for ease here. And then we have depth below ground. And typically we put our first sensor about 0.5 meters deep. And then we'll put our next sensor right above either the LNAPL plume or the groundwater table. And then we'll put a couple sensors in between. And when we do that, what we can do is we can see, we can use the diffusion calculation right here. This is Fick's first law. This is just change in concentration by depth, which you can readily calculate by just C2 minus C1. And this is depth, Z2 minus Z1. And what you do based on that is you can start to fill in that equation. And so you can see that here we have our depth change, which is 2.4 minus 0.4. And here we have our CO2 concentration, which we then convert to the appropriate units. And what that tells us is that on average, we're getting about 162 grams of CO2 emitting per cubic meter per meter. And then we subtract the background flux, because of course, every soil is going to have naturally some CO2 flux. It's how it's how basic organic matter leaves the soil after being inserted either through methanogenesis or, methanotrophs or photosynthesis. And we then subtract the background. And then what we get is and so in this hypothetical example, we have 98 grams of CO2 in the background. And so 162 minus 98 gives you 64 grams of CO2 being converted. Now, if you make assumptions about the next step is you've now calculated your CO2 flux, your methane flux, and your oxygen flux. And what you can then do is you then now start to convert that to how much hydrocarbons are depleted. And we typically know, so here's the flux, that this is the rate here that we just calculated, 64 grams. And this is called the diffusion coefficient. This varies between different soil textures. Typically we measure it per site, but you can also use some rule of thumbs, which are actually pretty accurate. And then you get a calculated flux, because remember, just because you measure a gradient, you need to understand what the diffusion coefficient is to actually understand what the actual diffusion coefficient is. So a good example is if you have a very low diffusion coefficient and you have a lot of CO2 here and not much here, that doesn't mean it's pumping out a lot of CO2 because it can't diffuse. But if it's a soil, let's say a sandy soil that has a very high diffusion coefficient, and you see a similar gradient, that tells you that that soil is generating a ton of CO2. So you have to incorporate the diffusion coefficient as well as the curve to understand how much carbon basically. I'm going to be talking about hydrocarbons, but you should be thinking about carbon on this because that's really what's going on. We're measuring carbon release from these soils. And we can convert it to a representative hydrocarbon, in this case, methane, using what's called a molar ratio. Basically, it's 2 moles of methane, 2 moles of hexane generate 12 moles of CO2. That gives us a ratio of 0.3. And so we do that conversion. We take this conversion, which remember we've incorporated our diffusion coefficient, multiply that by our ratio, and this tells us how much hexane is degrading per meter squared per day. So what this allows us to then do is to start collecting, estimate hydrocarbon release at a site without having to measure the hydrocarbon, because we're just measuring the gas flux. And so that brings me to the soil sense. So the soil sense was developed in collaboration with FCL, and one of the problems we had, or challenges, and I think anybody who's managed a degraded or contaminated site knows how frustrating this is. You make a management decision, and then you typically have to wait several years to see if it was the right decision. And so we needed a quicker way to improve that development cycle so that we could, look at the data, make a decision, and then see, was that the right decision or the wrong decision? Very rapidly try to optimize the systems. And what we realized is that we could measure CO2, oxygen, and methane profiles in real time in the soil. And we called it the soil sense. And how it works is it measures hydrocarbons, CO2, methane, oxygen at 3 different depths in the soil every 30 minutes, 365 days a year. And then there's some great local companies here. So one of the, as we developed EMS, we started reaching out to other local companies, and they said, well, why don't you guys use LoRa? SaskTel is deploying LoRa. It's a really effective system for monitoring. And what that then allows you to do is you're looking at a field installation of a soil sense in a pipeline right away. And so the soil sense sits down here in this standpipe. Here's a solar panel with what's called a top communication module. And what happens is that this gets concentrated, set up by a LoRa system, goes to our servers, and gets analyzed basically once or twice a day. And so using that, you can track carbon efflux or hydrocarbon degradation at these sites pretty well. It measures every 30 minutes. What we do is we look at month-long trends, and then every quarter we assess what's going on. The other thing about these sensors that I just want to point out for those of you who work on active sites is that they're intrinsically safe. So this is how you actually get a sensor like this into the soil. You create a borehole, and then this is the casing on the outside. And so what we would do is, in here is the soil sense. And the soil sense has these seals here and here, so no gas transfers up the borehole. And then the casing, so the pack between the casing and the soil, right here, this gets packed with soil. And then we have bentonite or grout, depends on the sort of soil and what's available, but we seal that. So what happens is you get this influx of soil gases directly to where these sensors are at each depth. So how do you practically use this? Well, here's an example of a small Saskatchewan town that will remain nameless. And what we do here is, in what you're looking at here in little orange circles are where we would put our soil senses. So you can imagine each one of these is a stack of 3 sensors that we put in the borehole. And here's an example of the plume. And so normally what we do is we always have a background, we put in the edges, and we put normally some in the plume. And you might say, why are you putting some in the edges? Well, the reason we do that is because over time, as ideally the plume shrinks, because you're directly measuring hydrocarbons in the soil vapor, you're able to actually measure plume dynamics as well as biological activity. So it allows you to track natural source zone depletion, and also allows you to track hydrocarbon plumes. And here's some examples of some of the sort of data you can get. On the left, what we can do is we can actually calculate how quickly a plume is degrading. And for those of you who don't work on contaminated sites, this might be a bit of a shocker, but let me just say that most of the time, if there has not been active management, sites will not close until between 300 and 1900 year time frame. Now, obviously, there's many sites that have already been actively managed, and many of those sites, in fact, Saskatchewan's one of the leaders in accepting natural source zone depletion as a closure mechanism. And normally what's happened there is somebody's done something active, and they say, look, it looks like this will reach closure status in 4 to 5 years, and you can monitor it relatively and non-invasively and measure that. In addition, because of where you place the soil senses and they're measuring hydrocarbons, you can ask questions about stability. And what I mean by stability is the plume increasing or not? Is the amount of impacted soil increasing or not? This becomes really important on active facilities or on situations where you're not too sure what's happening, because there's nothing worse than chasing a plume, where what happens is you deploy, you drill boreholes, and you're like, oh no, we missed it. And you got to go out next year, and you're basically always playing catch up. These allow you in real time to say, oh, good, the plume stabilized, or, uh-oh, we're seeing if we put on the edge, we can actually monitor it leaving. So how do you actually build this? Well, let's imagine that you wanted to do this for the Starks. So here's an example that this old dragon rendering facility, for those of you who are Game of Thrones, one of the people I work with loves Game of Thrones, so here's an example. The first thing you do is you build your lithology model. You can see here we have quite a complex site. This is a real site, by the way, not the Starks. This real site has been removed to protect the operators. And so you build the lithology model, and that's key because we really need to understand what's going on in the soil. And then we take those same boreholes and we build our contaminant model. And then what we're able to do is then you start monitoring the contaminant plume, and then you also begin to monitor natural source zone depletion. So these are two different things. The first is, here's the hydrocarbons we're seeing in the soil. And the second is, here's the biological activity we're tracking in the soil. And because you can track this in real time, remotely, what you can do is you can start looking at how did your remediation influence things? And at the end of the day, that's the reason we kind of invented these, is when I was doing research and still am doing research with FCL, they're trying all these different ways to clean up many of their sites, and they want to know what is working and what isn't. And so by using this, what you're able to do is track remediation and biological activity and stack it all together. Now, best case scenario, here's an example of a site in Southern Alberta where we're using these, and you can see that, oh, this actually looks pretty good. So the site, it has about a square foot of 300 square meters. It's not that big. It has a reasonable NSD rate, a bit low, but not too bad. There's not a lot of residual. This is a site that's been closed for 20 years, and it's just not cleaning very fast. And what we can estimate is, oh, well, good news. It's looking like you're losing about 15 kilograms of hydrocarbons per year through natural processes. So if we say, well, there's about 75 kilograms, we're losing 15 per year, then somewhere around by 5 years from now, we'll be able to close the site. And that's really helpful for FCL and others who have started to use EMS technology. And the reason is it allows them to prioritize. Because what you can do is you can start looking at sites that are depleting very quickly and say, oh, we don't actually need to work on that site. And then you're going to have other sites that aren't moving at all. And so it allows you to start to prioritize. When you have that list of 20 sites, you're trying to think, okay, which 2 or 3 I'm going to work on. You can say, well, look, these ones are naturally cleaning through natural processes, so I don't need to really intervene right now. But these top ones are ones that I need to consider more active, maybe excavation, maybe multi-phase extraction, but it does allow you to prioritize as an organization based on the biological activity. And what we're really doing here is we're providing new information to the site management teams so they can begin to incorporate biological activity, which is really natural source information. But of course, I've really talked about best case scenarios, right? If all sites were just naturally remediating, we would not have a $260 billion liability in Saskatchewan and Alberta. That just wouldn't exist. But they're not. This is what's normally happening, right? You have a site that you're like, oh my goodness gracious, it is not going to clean. My CEO is not happy about this. Our stakeholders are unhappy about this. What do we do about that? And I want to talk to you a little bit about some research work that we've done with FCL. And one of the key things that FCL realized by about 2008 is that most of the American approaches were not working here. And they weren't working in our soils because our soils were glaciated. And glaciated soils are high clay. And in the West here, they're very calcareous, right? Our pHs are normally about 7.5 and above. And this makes phosphorus really important in our soils, especially in our deep soils. And it's really difficult to get phosphorus into our soils. And just as a reminder, for every 100 parts of carbon, let's say from a hydrocarbon spill, you need 1 part of phosphorus at a minimum for the microbes to be able to remediate it, because they have to incorporate it into their biomass or they won't touch it. Similarly, if they need 10 parts of nitrogen. Well, nitrogen's a bit easier to manipulate. So what we did is we worked very carefully with FCL, and over the last probably 8 or 9 years, create a system we call biolodestone. And that's a fancy trade name, but in essence, what this is an optimized fertilizer for biostimulation for Saskatchewan Alberta soils. We're doing further work because we're trying to subdivide it. You know, I thought Melissa's presentation was quite good because she was showing the different soil maps and how you're seeing different agricultural productivity. That falls into the subsurface. It's not just on the surface. What you see at the surface of the soil is telling you a story what's going on 15 feet below. And so similar when we're remediating sites, we typically want to site specifically sort of optimize them. And that's what we call biolodestone. This is from a paper we published where we were able to show that one of the key things that's happening is we're basically creating this biogenic iron oxide. We're linking it with phosphorus availability and really getting quite astonishing results. And you can see on the right side, just a reminder that the soil sense provides this continuous estimation, because that was the two key things, how to add a biostimulant and how to sense it. You put the two things together in the field at the same time, and we use, the reason I have this slide in is I want to just remind people that the way to add a biostimulant to natural soils is not to push it in really hard. Instead, it is to infiltrate it. And the reason is our soils do not have matrix flow typically. Instead, they have what's called fractured flow. Or if you reach back, probably your soil physicist called it preferential flow. What happens is, this is a real picture, by the way. Jim Henry did this years ago, where he dug out some soils and then tracked all the fractures. So that's what's in the background there. It's a little stylized now, but that's actually from one of his papers. And so you have all these fractures and they change every year. If you pump slowly, it chases it through it naturally. And where those fractures are, that's where your fuel is or whatever pollutant you're chasing. They're not in the matrix. So if you add slow and steady is how you'll really help these soils. And so I want to just show you some results from our research with FCL, where we asked the question over the last, probably 6 or 7 years, does this remediation technology work? I mean, so far I've just talked, but now let's talk about some data. So we recently, submitted this, and we're really looking at sort of 4 key indicators. The first is groundwater nutrient pumping. Are we pumping so much nutrients that we're causing a nutrient plume? That would be really bad. We've designed biolodestone for that not to happen. It has concentrations that are below groundwater guidelines, but we needed to check it. Are we pushing a contaminant plume? This is a huge concern with stakeholders. If you have a plume and you're adding a biostimulant, one of the first questions is, aren't you going to move that plume off site? And this is why I wanted to bring up fractured flow. Because if you go slow and steady with these soils, you actually don't displace that plume. Normally plumes, now obviously a freshly released plume is still moving a lot due to gravity, but a lot of these sites are 10 or 15 or 20 years old. And what's happened is those plumes have reached a stability. And if you don't disturb the hydrodynamic gradient very much, so in other words, you don't change your water pressure too much, you're not going to push them. And that's how that's why you infiltrate. Soil electrical conductivity, one of the key questions is, does infiltration work? Because by tracking electrical conductivity of your soil samples, you can see if your biostim solution actually got there, because your biostim solution includes things like sulfate that EC will pick up. And then have we actually remediated sites? So I'm going to talk to you today about 6 sites. These are 6 trial sites that FCL initiated in 2015. And the possible concern was nutrients. Are we creating nutrient plumes? Really important. So we made sure our amendment solution didn't have those concentrations that were high enough to be a concern. We also made sure that we would pump them very slowly. And what you can see here, so across these 6 sites, what you're looking at, I turned off my little laser pointer at the very wrong time. You can see here on the left is ammonium, then nitrate, sulfate down here, TDS, phosphorus, which you would of course not expect to see much at all, and dissolved iron. And what you can see, it is almost none of our sites have we caused any sort of significant increase in those nutrients. Delineation wells, are we increasing the mobility at Apple? We inject the solution very slow at 32 mils a minute. That is, it's literally dripping into the soil. And yeah, we have not seen at any of our delineation wells, we don't see BTEX concentrations going up, and we don't see a sheen, which would make sense because we don't see the BTEX, but basically we're not moving the LNAP. And then soil electrical conductivity. Are we actually moving this through our injection? Because one of the concerns was, when we infiltrate, it'll absorb to the soil and it won't get anywhere. And so one of the questions we worked with FCL was, did this work? Well, yeah, at most of our sites, at most of our sites, it did work. I'm not going to tell you that things are perfect right now. We still occasionally have hotspots that, for reasons that are driving me a little crazy, quite frankly, and I've spent the last 3 or 4 years trying to understand what those residual hotspots are, but you're going to see they're very small spots, which I'm just going to say that this won't uniformly clean a site. We're still working on tweaking that. We get massive losses, which you're about to see, but we still do see this release. So can we decrease high concentrations? So this is often, you'll hear, for those of you who've gone through a civil engineering or environmental engineering background, the rule of thumb was you cannot biostim. You can't use biology until you're rid of your LNAP. And this was always frustrating because you'd run your MPE, your multi-phase extractor, for a year or two, and dang it would only get 5 or 10%, and there'd still be LNAP. Well, FCL was like, well, let's try it on some of our sites because we've tried everything else and it's not working. And what we found is that at these sites, we saw significant decreases. Now let's look at some of these sites in more detail because you'll see that this isn't, here's some real data. So here are 3 sites. You'll see that these sites began in 2016 and then we got 2019. We've got here where they began. And then here we've got our tier 1 guidelines, as well as sometimes they vary depending. We elected to focus on benzene for a couple, it's pretty universally, it's often present at most of the sites. It's an important constituent. Sometimes there's other constituents, we admit that, but we wanted to always kind of keep the same contaminant. And what you can see is that there's been a very large decrease. So on the left here in A is when it begins, and then B is about 3 years later. And what you're looking at here is these are called block model concentration modeling. And you can see that we've substantially reduced the volume. But notice here when I'm talking about occasionally we get hotspots that still drive us a little crazy. And we are working to understand, is that an injection issue? That's what engineers, of course, typically think. But as a biologist, I'm like, is there something going on in the biology there? And I have some fantastic students, M.A. Schreier, 2010, others who are spending a lot of time trying to understand, why is this still persisting? But, overall, the systems have amazing, this is our worst. Out of all the sites we've worked on, now it's been, I think, 10 or 12, this is our worst performer, 55%. This is more typical. In 4 years, you get about 90% reduction. You still occasionally get these hotspots. And so the question then becomes, how do you manage that site afterwards? And if you have a very small footprint, if you can go in basically with a backhoe and 1 truck, it's worthwhile to just sort of dig it up and be done. Or what we're trying this year, which I'm very excited about, we're working with Stantec and FCL to actually just mix it on site and put it back in. That may solve that problem because remember, it's a very small hotspot, typically maybe 1 cubic meter. Let's look at 3 more sites. So here's sites 4, 5, 6. Same sort of issue here where you're looking at the initial and then the right. These sites started ran a little bit longer. And you can see that these sites, some of them were very successful. Site 4, of course, we're very happy with. Site 5 also worked pretty well. These sites also had similar reductions. Quite substantial, as you can see, averaging about 90%. When people ask me, I'm like, well, if you biostim, normally within 4 or 5 years, you're gonna get 90% reduction. Sometimes if you're lucky, you'll see like at site 4 and site 6, you're getting up to 97% reduction. And then you might, when I'm talking about excavation, it's kind of worthwhile sometimes just go in and quickly excavate this. Now, one of the key things when we were working with FCL was, can we make systems that significantly benefit the environment? I know that people who do a lot of remediation, they're often moving a lot of iron and a lot of soils. As a soil scientist, I got to tell you, it hurts my soul when I see people trucking out soil. And the reason is, I hope most people probably know this, but we only lay down about 1 centimeter or 2 centimeters of soil every year. And so when you excavate a cubic meter and put it into a landfill, you're taking about 100 million years of development. So you're really depleting our natural capital. And I know most people know that, and they really don't like to excavate. They're often not given a choice, either regulator or stakeholder concerns or the need to move rapidly. But one of the reasons FCL, this is all part of FCL's sustainability drive. How can we make our operations more sustainable? And here's a good example. This is how it does it. When we take a look at these 6 sites, So here's the environmental benefits of using this biostim solution approach with the monitoring. And the CO2 emissions are substantial. You can see here for every site, it's typically millions of kilograms. And the reason is that you are not moving big iron to dig out soils. You also have a substantial amount of water savings. 11,000 cubic meters is 11 million liters of water saved. Because what often people forget is you dig up a cubic meter of soil. Well, 30% of that is water, but that water is mixed in with hydrocarbons. So you got to clean it. So you got to use other soil for that. You got to use, other water for that. And then, of course, because of sloping, if you have 1 cubic meter, you're actually normally excavating about 30% more because of sloping effects. So the whole thing starts to accelerate on you. And then, of course, right here, this is the stuff as a soil scientist I'm most proud of, because this is how much soil we've diverted from the landfills. Now, some of this could be land farmed, but remember, this is coming up pretty from the deep, right? This is coming up from 4 or 5 meters. So it's clay, really hard to work with. So this work with FCL that we formed EMS to help commercialize, because what we noticed was FCL has gotten very good at using this. And they're like, oh, other people would want to use this. And FCL's like, well, our primary business line is not in environmental. So they worked with us to set up this commercialization venture. And what this allows us to do is this combination of the soil sense provides you real-time data, and that allows your team to make decisions. Do we excavate? Do we run an MPE? Should we biostim? And then working with FCL, we created a biostim that works pretty well. And I think what I tell people is the reason that I really do think the soil sense is very helpful. And the reason is it really takes the guesswork out of your site management. You can look at what's happening, like right now we're tracking sites, right now, January. Well, now it's February, and you can see remediation happening. You can monitor the hydrocarbons, and you can do that so that as you're planning for, we all know spring's coming pretty soon. Most people on this call are probably very busy already doing their field planning. You can actually be looking at data in real time and not making decisions based on last year or just on groundwater data. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Sure. Thank you so much, Stephen. That was great. It was nice to see how years of science and research have been turned into technology that can be successful.
I really do want to put a shout out to FCL, right? Because they had to be very patient. This work started in 2010, and now it's 2022, and we're just starting to commercialize the technology. I think that a lot of companies don't have that sort of patience. It's one of the great things about co-ops. They're more patient than other, let's say, there's a reason why some other companies haven't sponsored this. So it's good to see.
Mm-hmm. So if anyone has a question for Stephen, please type it into the Q&A box and we'll get to them. In the meantime, so once a site is cleaned by this technology, how many years before it can go to the next step in reclamation or restoration?
Well, that's a really interesting question. And I see that Shirley Bartz has sort of asked this exact question, right? Your restoration activity is often focused on restoring a cropped site to a native plant community or removing weeds. What biological activity can soil sense provide in this kind of restoration? And how does it manage the soil health with the addition of native plants? And Shirley, that's a great question. So in that context, remember the soil sense, everything I talked about today was in the case of hydrocarbon remediation, but let's imagine there's no more hydrocarbons left. You've already left that, you're remediated, and now you're trying to get that system back to a productive system. And so you've managed the salts and all that sort of stuff. So what the soil sense actually measures is it measures CO2, so that's basal soil respiration, which is a good indicator of soil microbe activity. It also measures methanogens, so that tells you how anaerobic your soil is, as well as methanotrophs. So it's giving you that balance of basically what it's measuring is how the carbon is moving in and out of soil. It also measures oxygen and temperature and moisture all at the same time, because we need to measure temperature and moisture to do our calculations correctly. So what you have is this ability to measure temperature, moisture, and then measuring soil microbial, basal soil microbial activity, as well as one section of that of methanogens. Now, I have to tell you right now, like me and Eric have been kind of brainstorming. For those of you who know the Kernan restoration site, I've done a lot of work on there with Eric over the years, and they have these long-term enclosures. And there's been some great work from the U of A showing that long-term cattle grazing can actually, when it's done properly, can actually create carbon sequestration in the soil. And what the soil sense allows you to do is measure. So I'm a little bit of a heretic here. We can imagine soil carbon as a huge pool in the soil, and it turns over really, really slowly. We have crop inputs, photosynthetic, and then we have losses, CO2 and methane. And the soil sense measures the losses. And the photosynthetic activity you can measure through basically measuring typical photosynthetic activity. So the soil sense allows you to measure that carbon balance and how it's changing. The analogy I get to people, as you can see from my hair, that I'm a little old. And, you know, if you wanted to see if I was losing weight or not, what I can tell you is it doesn't all happen at once, right? Measuring my weight every day is not very helpful. But if you find out that I'm eating a cupcake every day, you're like, I'm pretty sure you're going to end up gaining weight. And so it's the same in the soil. If we measure the inputs and outputs, it's not so important what the mass is, because that mass, if it's a net positive every year, then we can measure, we know over time that we're doing it right. So that's what our thinking is when we think about native plant restoration, is that because the soil sense measures that basal soil microbial activity, that will allow us to actually make inferences and watch. For those of you know, Kernan has 7 different invasive species. It's also got it's got the vet herd on it. And so we can look at this interaction of grazing and invasion species. And also Eric's been doing prescribed burning. So one of my PhD students, always co-supervised with Eric, Amzad, is trying to understand how that's changing things. And we're hoping that the soil sense will be able to give us sort of a fingerprint on long-term activities.
Very cool.
There's a couple other advantages I just want to say about soils. I don't want to sound like a vendor, but here's the thing.
No,
so SAS tells Royal LoRa, which means you can put sensors almost anywhere and they work, and it's not too expensive. Secondly, the detectors we use in the soil sense are called pyroelectric detectors. So this is a new breed of IR detector that generates its own electricity from an IR source. And so what it means is these soil sensors are running either off solar power, like you saw, or just a couple batteries. And that really, I think, allows us to start asking interesting questions at these sort of native sites that are far from places and that we might need to monitor for 5 years sustainably.
All right. There aren't any other questions so far. So like going back to my question, like how long would it take before a site is remediated with your soil sense to moving on to the next stage? Like, can you seed that area afterwards? Like, is it that clean?
Yeah, well, actually, in fact, many of the impacted sites already have pretty good vegetation cover.
Oh, okay.
So for example, normally, it depends where the spill is, but normally what's normally the biggest challenge, now not for FCL sites because of the nature of their operation, but a good rule of thumb is that for every liter of fuel of like crude spilled, 10 liters of brine are spilled. And I think everyone on this call has managed brine. So the real challenge for the plants is the brine, but the hydrocarbons normally not. In fact, there's some old work back in the 80s where they were using crude oil as a fertilizer. There's some actual trials that were done in southern Saskatchewan where they sprayed crude oil.
Okay.
And so I'm not sure how, now we're getting lots of questions.
Yeah.
Do you want me to read them out or do you want to, Carol?
I can read them. The first one is, I'm sorry if I missed this, but could you talk more about what's in the biostimulant and the microbial processes it promotes?
Sure. So the whole concept of the biostimulant is the recognition that if you improve soil health, and I think I'm preaching to the choir here, they'll naturally remediate. You don't need to add special inoculants. So what we do is we add the key electron acceptors that they need. So they always need nitrate, they always need sulfate, they always need iron 3, which can be hard to add in soil. So we make sure we add a soluble form of that. And then in terms of the phosphorus, we add a special type of phosphorus that's mobile, that doesn't get fixed. So we give them nitrogen, we give them phosphorus, and we give them those electronic receptors. And what happens is you get this robust microbial community. So Anya Ulrich from the U of A really discovered this. You get this kind of consortia that'll rapidly degrade things rather than everyone hears about the magic bullet, but if you have a consortia, it'll actually work really well. So it's basically general anaerobic processes that really stimulate the remediation.
Thank you. And Clinton asks, with the increased use of tile drainage to drain wetlands in low areas with salt accumulations to pull those minerals, etc., down and out the end of the tile onto their neighbor land, is there a use of your technology to monitor the effects of the soil profiles where the effluent is deposited?
The answer to that is yes, but I will say we've also applied to ADF to build a new salt sensor that would work with these, because we realized that a lot of people, Clinton's really sort of hit the nail on the head. You're managing multiple issues. You need to look at the soil health, but you also need a good way to measure soil electrical conductivity. The current methods are good, but they're very power hungry. And remember, our whole idea here is to be able to send sensors out and then not have to go back. Because if you can do that, you can make it really cheap. And also for everyone here knows, I mean, I don't do a lot of eco restoration, but I work with Catherine Stewart and Eric Lamb who do a lot of it. And I know it takes years. So we have to come up with ways that we can cheaply monitor it. And yeah, so our technology should be able to work under those situations. One of our scientists, Bipin, is actually working with the U of S chemistry department to build up that sensor, which we think will work.
Okay. Beth asks, did you mention the cost per site or the cost per year to implement this?
No, I didn't. So normally what we do to help save money for everyone involved, we normally rent our equipment. You'll see Ground Effects Engineering does that as well. So normally one distributor to add the biostim is about 35 grand a year. And that includes everything. And then each soil sands, depending on how many you need, are rented out at $8,000 a year. Now, those are for hydrocarbon sites. For native prairie sites, one of the things that'll happen is we won't need to add the hydrocarbon sensors, which are super expensive. So I'm working with Eric to figure out what would be the price for a site that, let's say you're trying to do restoration and you want to measure carbon sequestration. Well, then you don't need the hydrocarbon sensors, which really reduce our costs because these sensors are expensive. For example, competitive sensors are normally, they're costing maybe 12 grand to build. And so they can become very expensive. And quite frankly, the reason we rent them is you saw all the analytical that has to happen, all the data analytics. And so then we provide that as part of that. You get quarterly reports as part of that.
Okay. Shirley has another question. How long have you been collaborating with Eric? And do you have any preliminary data from your soil sense on how grazing and burning is contributing to restoring the site?
How long have I been collaborating with Eric? So when Eric came here from the U of A, he did his postdoc with me, and then he transitioned to a professor here. So however long that is, I've been working with him. And me and him did a ton of work in the Arctic. So for those of you who are wondering why I'm doing this sort of stuff, is because I was an idiot. For about 15 years, I did all this Arctic climate change work because I thought if we told people how bad climate change and what was happening to Arctic soils, that they would listen and make a change. And then what happened is I started working with FCL and I realized, oh, maybe we can make technologies and solutions that allow, there's all these people, all these change leaders and organizations that want to make a change, but they get stuck because they don't know what to, they know what they want, but they don't have the technology to do it. And when they approach their controller, and she's like, well, that's going to cost like 400 grand. We can't do that. Can you do something cheaper? And so, so me and Eric worked in the Arctic, and then I started working with Eric over the years at Kernan. I don't work with him on the prescribed burning because that, for those of you who've done it, it's crazy what you guys do. I don't know. That's very scary to me, running around with liquid fire, but he does it. He's very much a believer in it. And so we've been talking about how to use soil sense in 2022. And I think we'll see how it goes this year. The nice thing about Kernan is it's close. We've both worked on it for years. So by next year, maybe we'll have AMSAT present, one of our PhD students, if you guys want, or at least a poster. And he can tell you guys maybe how it worked on that. That's what we're hoping to do this year.
Awesome. So our next restoration workshop won't be until 2024. So that will give you more time. Then. Yeah. And so it'll be in Saskatoon as well. So
Well, then
No
hopefully
commute.
we can go out to Kernan, because I know that Eric's got these visions of these large sort of projects. So it'd be great to have a site visit and go out to Kernan.
Yeah, field trip.
It's all, yeah, it's all surrounded by trees, by not trees anymore. Sorry, by houses. We just, you know, he's been doing a ton of work to try to convince the city of Saskatoon not to destroy it. I think they've been successful. I think everyone on this call knows how difficult it can be to convince land developers about the value of land that is not developed. But yeah, that would be great, actually. By 2024, we'll have, I think, a pretty good idea. I'm hoping to have really good ideas. And if we can convince other people to let us test our sensors on other environments, that would be good.
Awesome. So we do have a few more minutes if there's any questions that anyone has not asked yet. So we'll just hold on a second, but in the meantime, I really enjoyed that. Soil and industry isn't my area, and I really enjoyed your presentation. It's nice to see that side of it instead of the
Well, I think one of the best field trips I ever did was up into the Arctic for about 2 months, and Eric came with me and a geologist came with me. So we had a geologist, we had a soil scientist, and a plant ecologist. And I really think that it is the dream team for field experiences. I'm not saying that it was us that were the dream team, but the idea to have someone, because as a soil scientist, I mean, I hate to say it, my plant ID skills are red, dead, and green typically. And, and so Eric's able to really give us nuance. At the same time, I can talk about the soils. And then for those of you who have ever been to the Arctic, you know that we see surface geology all the time. So they're able to sort of talk about, where the soils, sort of all that history. It was really, really very effective and a great time. And I think that for those of you who are only plant scientists, if you can collaborate with a soil scientist, I think you'll find it very productive. Certainly my collaborations with Eric are some of the funnest things we ever do.
And I think we're seeing in at least recent years more focus on soil. Like we've had, at least with the restoration workshop, we've had more presentations with microbes and things like that, where it wasn't part of the conversation before in the early years. So I think it's nice to have more soil in our workshop.
Yeah, well, one of the kind of crazier ideas myself, Catherine, and Eric have been bouncing around is these distributors work off. We've built these unique pumps that use local groundwater, and they're solar powered. And so, for those of you who've ever worked on heavily degraded lands, you know what a challenge they are to restore. They're very, very difficult. And, I spent a fair amount of time up in Creighton and Flin Flon trying to restore those lands, and they're incredibly difficult. And it's just, a lot of it is just cost. You have to restore the soils before the plants. If you plant plants into crappy soils, they're just going to die or they're going to get invaded. And so one of the things we've been trying to work out is with the distributor, what would be, that optimization solution I talked about, that was optimized for hydrocarbons. And the question is, can we come up with a restoration solution? Can we come up, and Catherine's sort of been experimenting around the edges here about what do we know we should not add? A good example would be nitrate. Don't add nitrogen fertilizer. That'd be an incredibly bad idea. But what about, what can we add to allow the native plants to be able to really establish themselves and protect themselves against invasion fronts in a heavily degraded landscape? That's also something we currently don't have data on, but I do think as we develop these technologies, basically put other new tools in plant ecologists' tool belts so that they're not just seeding and praying, that they're oh, we're going to seed and we're going to add this and we're going to monitor that and that should work, and maybe we'll add some goats and everyone will be happy, or at least they'll get to do yoga.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Stephen, for joining us today. Really enjoyed
Thanks
your
for inviting me.
presentation.
Really appreciate it. If anybody has any questions or want more details, please reach out to me. You can see me at the USask or the EMS, either one. I'm happy to chat and bounce around ideas, as you can imagine. Remember that, technology I present today, it took about 10 years to develop. And so I'm really interested, and I do truly believe that restoration is the key to the future. I think remediation, I'm not gonna say we got it sorted, but I think, Carolyn, you know how important that is. And so I'm very interested in talking to people what their ideas are, and maybe we can set up some trials, and because we're a university, we can do things cheaper than commercial. Anyways, I'm always interested in exploring those ideas.
Sure. I don't think your email address is listed on your profile on the Feed Loop site, but I can add it if you would like.
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to. Yeah, please
Sure.
reach out.
And then if anyone, then they can find your email address there. Do you prefer
Excellent.
your EMS one or your USask?
It doesn't matter. They both work. I check them all the time.
Okay, sounds good.
Thank
Okay,
you
well,
very
thanks
much.
again, Stephen. We're going to take another break. It is now 11:25, and so we'll be back at 11:30 Saskatchewan time for Mandy's presentation. So enjoy your bio break. Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a good little break. So I don't think we've ever had a presentation on BioCrest before. So this is a first for our restoration workshop. So welcome, Mandy. I'm so glad you could be here today. And just to introduce Mandy, Mandy Slate is a community ecologist interested in BioCrest and better integrating BioCrest into the field of restoration ecology. Mandy earned her PhD at the University of Montana and is currently a postdoc at the University of Colorado, Boulder. So we see your presentation already, so you can get started.
All right. I'm so excited to talk to you all today about BioCrest. And so since I sent this title in, I realized that really I should have reversed my order a little to kind of better reflect what I'll be sharing today. So I'm going to start off with an introduction on what BioCrest are to make sure we're all on the same page. And then next, I think the why you should care is one of the most important components. So I'll review what we know about what BioCrest are doing and why what they do is so important. And then finally, because BioCrest are so important, there's a growing effort to consider them when we think about how we restore ecosystems, and also an effort to figure out how to restore BioCrest directly. So I'll be reviewing both of these areas of research. Now, before I dive in, though, I want to say sadly that I've never been to where you are in Northern Canada. I'm going to hopefully say this name right, Saskatchewan, to see your prairies. But I've been looking at a lot of pictures lately, and most of my work has been in northwestern Montana in the Intermountain grasslands, which are similar, but it looks like a little different. But I would expect that you have lots of BioCrest in your shrublands, in your shortgrass prairie, and your mixed grass prairie. But I would expect them to be less common in your tall grass prairie systems because they don't do so well with all the extra plant litter and when not enough sun gets in. So I've included a section at the end of this presentation as a sort of primer to help you spot BioCrest. And that is why I've added my, my website and my email address here, and I can put it in chat at the end. I would love to see photos, or if you have any questions, you're interested in talking more about BioCrest, I'm always game to do that. So most dryland plant research centers around the most obvious players, the grasses, the forbs, the shrubs, and the trees. But covering the soil surface and filling the interspaces among these plants are BioCrest. BioCrest, which are also known as biological, cryptobiotic, cryptogamic, microbiotic, or biotic soil crust, are complex communities of moss, cyanobacteria, lichen, and other microorganisms, and they occur on soil surfaces where they intimately associate with and aggregate the top few millimeters of soil. So here I've included a few photos of cyanobacteria-dominated BioCrest, which really show this soil surface aggregation well. I also want you to see a few examples of other types of BioCrest so you get a feel for their diversity across dryland systems. So these two photos on the left are also cyanobacteria-dominated BioCrest. They look really different than those other ones I showed you. And then we have lichen and moss-dominated BioCrest, and then moss-dominated BioCrest on the far right. So the composition of BioCrest communities changes drastically over both small and large scales. Now, BioCrests are incredibly common in arid locations like these. You can actually see them. BioCrests are the darker part of this on the soil surface here. And just note how much space they cover compared to the vascular plants in these systems. BioCrests also occur in forested ecosystems where they can contribute substantial amounts of biomass, and they can be some of the first colonizers after forest fire. And then biocrests are extremely abundant in the alpine and high latitude ecosystems, where they're often the dominant photosynthetic community. So we have a highly generalized classification system for the 4 main types of biocrest encountered throughout drylands. And this is primarily based on the composition of the biocrest community in that location and how that influences surface topography. So I'll go through these one by one. So starting in more arid locations, soil surfaces are often covered by these light algal fungal biocrest. So these types of biocrest have a flat topography, and while the algae and fungi themselves are difficult to see, you can see these dangly fungal filaments when these crusts are broken. Now, biocrust topography changes somewhat as you move into hotter deserts, where in addition to cyanobacteria, you start seeing some mosses and lichen, and this contributes this patchy topography to create a rugose topography, we call it. And then in cold deserts, we start to see this amazing pinnacled phytocrust. This is where we have lots of frost heaving, and these pinnacles can be up to 15 centimeters tall, covered by 40% lichen and moss. And clearly we have a really high level of surface roughness. These types of biocrests are really common throughout the Colorado Plateau. And finally, the rolling biocrests, which are found in cool deserts also up to semi-arid grass and shrubland systems, where the higher levels of precipitation can support these extensive mats of lichen and moss. And then the frost heaving of these surfaces results in this gently rolling topography. These are the types of biocrests you will encounter in the Saskatchewan grasslands. And while this example is primarily moss, lichen are also abundant in rolling biocrest. And so, as I said, I'll be showing more pictures with lichen in them later. So these differences in soil surface roughness and biocrest community composition impact how biocrests influence their ecosystem. So I'll go through these 5 ecosystem services of biocrest one by one, starting with soil stability, and then I'll discuss the hydrological impacts, how biocrests buffer soil temperatures, how biocrests help create fertility in soils, and then how they interact with vascular plants. And just to clarify, in some cases, I'll focus on the impact of a specific biocrest type or organism, while in others, for the sake of time, I'll be generalizing a little more across biocrest types. So biocrests play a really important role in drylands for their ability to stabilize soil. This greatly reduces erosion. And the ability of cyanobacteria to aggregate soils is a key component of this. So how do cyanobacteria do this? Well, there's 2 ways. So cyanobacteria, each of these strings is a cyanobacteria. They produce these protective coatings of polysaccharides, which are really sticky sugars. And these polysaccharides bind with clay to create these protective sheets around colonies of cyanobacteria. And so this protects them against soil predators and changes in environmental conditions. And this is their chemical influence on soil stability. So these sheets wind through sandy soils, and they firmly attach themselves to individual sand grains. And then this is how cyanobacteria physically stabilize soil. Biocrests can also influence soil hydrology, and they do this in a few different ways. And here I'll be focusing on how biocrest mosses increase water capture and retention. So mosses in general, as you know, I'm sure, have no vascular system and no roots. And they pretty much go dormant when they're not in immediate contact with water. But when water is available again and they rehydrate, mosses can absorb over 100 times their dry weight. They're basically like little sponges on the landscape. And so this drastically increases the capture and retention of water. And then biocrest impacts on surface topography can also influence how water moves along the landscape. So with this example in this photo on the far right, we see differences in topography create these twisty runoff pathways. And it makes water move more slowly across the landscape, leaving more time for it to be absorbed and decreasing the amount of soil particles that are washed away. And then whether hydrated or desiccated, biocrest buffering effects on soil temperature extremes are really most important on co-occurring plants and soil microbes during periods of time when temperatures are rapidly fluctuating. So one example would be that soil could be maintained at a slightly warmer temperature during a late spring snow, or kept at a slightly cooler temperature during the spring or fall heat spell. So this ability of BioCrest to mediate soil temperatures and moisture conditions contributes directly to the BioCrest effects on soil fertility, which I'll discuss next, because they prolong soil microbial activity. So when we think of how BioCrest help create soil fertility, carbon is one of the first things that comes to mind. All BioCrest organisms fix carbon, meaning that they're converting inorganic carbon, usually from the form of carbon dioxide, into organic carbon compounds. And so in our case, this is happening all through the process of photosynthesis. So over time, this carbon will become available to heterotrophic soil biota. And this will be as BioCrest organisms are damaged or die. And then we know that BioCrests generally are increasing the amount of carbon stored in soils. Nitrogen is generally one of the most limiting nutrients in dryland soils, and so BioCrests contribute to soil fertility in another way by increasing the amount of nitrogen available for both plants and soil biota. And the main way they do this is through the process of nitrogen fixation, whereby atmospheric nitrogen, which is readily available, is converted to organic and ultimately inorganic nitrogen compounds. Now, cyanobacteria, both those that are free living and the photobionts of lichen, are really the workhorses of this in the BioCrest community. Finally, BioCrests help create soil fertility by capturing dust. So in this example here, this difference in fine material, which basically is becoming topsoil, with and without BioCrest, is primarily attributed to dust capture by these authors. So how do BioCrests do this? Well, this brings us back to those 4 types of BioCrest topographies and the differences in soil surface roughness that are related to the community composition of the BioCrest, and how they create these tiny, tiny microvalleys that can capture and trap dust particles. And so when I first heard this, I remember thinking, oh, that's pretty cool, but it's dust. So what? I didn't get it. But it turns out that dust provides essential nutrients. It is, after all, just topsoil being blown around. So we want to keep that in the system, and BioCrests are important for that. And trapping more of it would be very helpful. And so this really hasn't been looked at much, but this table is taken from this study, which was done on the Colorado Plateau. And they found that the dust trapped in BioCrest had substantially more of each of these essential elements when compared to the local bedrock. And so concluded that BioCrest dust capture is actually an important source of soil resources. Now, BioCrests are coexisting with vascular plants. You may not always think of them or see them, but if BioCrests and vascular plants are occurring, I would argue that we need to understand how they're interacting. And I think this is one of the most exciting areas of research for me. I'm definitely biased because this is what I do, but I have to say it's also one of the most complex. So we're just kind of going to brush the surface of what we know. So this photo is of cyanolichen BioCrests, and hopefully you can see the seeds here and their very long appendages. So you would think that the ability of BioCrests to capture seeds, capture dust and other organic materials and water, and bring these resources together would be a wonderful thing for plant establishment. And it can be, but BioCrest seed capture is influenced by both BioCrests and seed morphologies, so the outcomes are highly variable. So similar to the example with dust capture, the more complex microvalleys and topographies of BioCrest actually do a better job at capturing more dispersing seeds. And then seed appendages and seed size can play a key role in this. So seeds with spiny appendages or that are very small can lodge themselves into BioCrest microvalleys. And the benefit of accessing a microvalley is that seedling roots have an easier and faster time of accessing soil. And so this is particularly important in our dryland systems where precipitation is delivered in these brief, unpredictable pulses. And when seeds are not lodged into microvalleys, BioCrests can actually be impenetrable for seedling roots and decrease plant establishment. So this can be really good news if we're talking about invasive plants, or bad news if we're trying to establish native plants. But if plants do germinate and establish, they have access to those buffered soil temperatures, extra moisture, and extra nutrients that BioCrest provide, and this tends to benefit plant growth. And because of this, we see bigger benefits from growing in or next to the rolling type of BioCrest with their complex topographies than the other types of BioCrests. Now I'm going to step back there because the story is more complex, as I mentioned, and we don't have time to go there. So as vascular plants establish, they impact the BioCrest community development or succession, and this cycle is constantly in motion, with many of the BioCrest impacts on vascular plants even being species specific. And then they vary over time as BioCrest communities change in composition. Now, in addition to BioCrest being important for their ecosystem services, BioCrests are also being hit hard by global change. Droughts of unprecedented intensity are widespread and now common across Canadian prairie systems and drylands worldwide. And I know this is a phenomenon you are intimately familiar with. And while we may think that organisms that are well adapted to living in these semi-arid and arid systems could survive these hotter and drier conditions, we know that's not the case for vascular plants, and it's also not the case for BioCrest organisms. BioCrests are also incredibly sensitive to compressive forces. And once they're disturbed, whether from fire, grazing pressure, or even recreation, they can be very slow to reestablish, like on the scale of decades to even centuries in the most arid locations they occur. And this is because their growth can only occur when they're hydrated. Precipitation is limited, right? And so changes in climate are slowing BioCrest recovery and altering the composition of BioCrest communities. Further, without BioCrest stabilizing soils, we're noticing drastic increases in dryland wind and water erosion. Now, BioCrest disturbance also often leads to the proliferation of invasive plant species. And we know this is particularly a problem when we see species like the one shown here that take over huge swaths of land and become nearly impossible to eradicate. So I hope just with this brief introduction, you can have a better understanding now of what BioCrests are and why they're important. And then I want to switch now for the second part of the talk to the focus of this conference and discuss ideas in recent research aimed at preserving and minimizing the impact of land use and restoration efforts on BioCrests, and then talk about efforts to restore BioCrests. So I'll lead off with the first of these topics. And as we know, there's many components of land use and restoration to consider when it comes to BioCrests. So I'm only going to focus on 3, and we'll start with grazing management. So while it's true that BioCrests are sensitive to compressive forces, our northern grasslands have also evolved with ungulates, both large and small. But in comparison to the modern day ungulate inhabitants, these native ungulates roamed. And though they could and can be very destructive, they were able to move about. And so the main downfall of keeping cattle in one place is overgrazing. We all know this, right? We see this clearly on the right side of this fence. And overgrazing is a major cause of plant destruction, soil compaction, and erosion. But the challenge lies in needing to identify sustainable and productive practices that maximize both landscape function and stocking rates. And rotational grazing is one strategy used to do this. So it involves controlling livestock access to pastures by allowing animals to graze in designated fields for only limited periods of time, and then being rotated to fresh pasture. And so while the primary focus of land managers has surely not been minimizing BioCrest disturbance, my own observations and that of this recent research suggest that rotational grazing may actually minimize BioCrest disturbance and provide time, this may be the most important part, for BioCrest to at least partially reestablish. And so to my knowledge, this is actually the only study that has explicitly considered this. So while BioCrest may seem like a hard sell to land managers, I've been really surprised to find a really warm reception. And so this is something that definitely needs to be looked into further and at greater depth. And if this is something you do or are interested in looking at further, I would love to talk about this more with you. And next, herbicide applications. So over 1 billion pounds of herbicides are applied every year in North America to combat invasive weeds. And there's many pros and cons of herbicide use, which for the sake of time, I won't go into, but there's been very little effort to understand how herbicides are influencing BioCrest communities. So I started to think about this after considering the very drastic differences in morphology between BioCrest organisms and vascular plants. So these photos depict cross-sections of a vascular plant leaf, cross-section of vascular plant leaf, of a moss leaf, and of a lichen thallus. So vascular plant leaves are coated in a waxy epidermis, right? And that protects the multiple layers of cells. Water does not enter or leave through this cuticle. In contrast, moss leaves are 1 to maybe 2 cells thick. There's no waxy cuticle, and water enters and leaves through the simple process of diffusion. Then with the lichen thallus, this is the leaf-like part of a lichen. Lichens, remember, form as a symbiosis between fungi and algae or cyanobacteria. And again, there's no waxy cuticle. These cells in the upper portion of the thallus are fungal cells. And then just below these densely packed fungal cells, we have the algal or cyanobacterial layer. So we're talking multiple types of organisms that could be impacted by herbicides. And herbicides are usually applied in liquid form. And for that herbicide to enter a leaf, it needs to break down the cuticle. And this is where surfactants come in. There's many types of surfactants that act in many different ways, but the ultimate goal is to help that herbicide stay on, coat the leaf, and break down that cuticle so that the herbicide can get into the plant tissue and kill the plant, right? We have little to no idea how herbicides or surfactants influence BioCrest mosses and lichen in dry grassland. And so to look at this, I set up a field study where I sprayed moss or lichen dominated BioCrest with one of three of these herbicides or the surfactant alone or in combination. And then I compare changes in BioCrest cover both 1 and 2 years after application of these treatments with that of BioCrest that were just sprayed with water as a control. And so here I'm just showing some of the treatments. Here's that surfactant, a single herbicide, surfactants and herbicides together, and then the water treatment control. And then we have BioCrest cover on the y-axis, and I've separated the effects of lichen and moss. Okay, so I added these treatments in 2018. These are the filled circles. This is our reference. And then I measured the cover again in 2019, the open circles. And you can see there's really no difference. And so this is great news. The herbicides and surfactants alone or together had negligible effects on BioCrest cover. And particularly when it was compared with the effects of water, which were quite negative. And sadly, that's going to have to be a story for another day. And then 2 years later, these gray circles in 2020, we did see a general negative trend for BioCrest moss cover for all of these treatments. But since it was for all treatments, we really think that this is an effect of climate because it followed a very dry winter and spring. There were a few cases where lichen cover also declined, and that's something I do need to look into a little deeper. But overall, I actually see these results as really positive. And I'd say the next step is to consider how the timing of herbicide application might impact BioCrest, how BioCrest might respond to multiple herbicide applications, and how there's still lots of different herbicides and surfactant combinations to consider. So whether or not you're in favor of herbicide use, it's encouraging to know, since their use will be continuing, that some herbicides at least may have little to no impact on BioCrest. So I'll be circling back to this in a few minutes too when I discuss some BioCrest restoration strategies. And lastly, there's some evidence that BioCrest, when they are intact and not disturbed, can inhibit the establishment of invasive plant species. And this may be particularly true for the rolling BioCrest types that we have in our northern grasslands. Instead, for the pinnacled and rugose BioCrest, their effects on invasive plants seem to be more species specific. So I found when looking at this that in northern Montana grasslands, for 3 of our most invasive plants, Bromus tectorum, Centaurea stevie, and Potentilla recta, that when BioCrest were disturbed, the establishment of these invasive plants was 2 times higher than it was when the biocrest were intact because they kept them out. But sadly, when biocrest disturbance coincided with a spring drought, 4 times as many invasive plants established than native plants. So this is something we definitely need to think about. And I think it even harkens back to something Stephen was just saying about things we're not thinking about in systems, things we can add to heavily degraded sites to help keep out invasive species. And maybe biocrests are something we really need to consider more. So clearly there's many more land management strategies to consider, but I think it's exciting to see some grazing strategies that are already in place, which may be helping to minimize biocrest damage and combat the spread of invasive species, and then maybe even reducing the need for herbicides. But it's exciting to find that some of them may not be incredibly damaging to biocrests. So next, I want to briefly discuss some of the work myself and others have been doing to reestablish biocrests after disturbances. And these are big disturbances, so this is something else that could fit in with totally new ways to think about restoration. So it's kind of hard to see what's happening here, and I apologize, this was the only photo I had. But this is an area with biocrest that's been heavily trampled by a herd of wild horses. And then it subsequently experienced a fair amount of erosion. You can kind of see how the water moved through here. These are a few of my plots up in marked in blue that were spared, thankfully. So when we have a disturbed area like this and we want to restore the biocrest community, our first decision would be whether we wait until the biocrests grow back. This would be passive restoration, or we decide to expedite biocrest recovery with active restoration strategies. And so in this example, the fact that there are still bits of biocrest scattered around can make this a really good choice for passive restoration. But depending on our restoration goals and the length of time we want to meet those in, this might make this strategy prohibitive. Instead, we could invest in active restoration strategies. So there are numerous barriers still to active biocrest restoration, but when it works, it really does expedite biocrest recovery. And this approach is really similar to what we would do for vascular plants, right? We create a stable substrate with adequate resources for plant growth, and then we'd add in seeds or seedlings. So in some ways, this is actually a little easier with biocrests because all biocrest organisms can regenerate vegetatively. For example, with biocrest mosses, we can dry and crumble a leaf into tiny pieces, and each fragment will regrow itself. So rather than collecting seeds, we need to harvest or cultivate biocrest to use as an inoculum for restoration. So I'll first share where we're at in terms of overcoming these first 2 barriers of soil erosion and of having enough biocrest inoculant. So what we don't want is for any of the biocrests we add to wash or blow away. And we've had some success with spraying on tackifiers like psyllium during inoculation. So this helps to stabilize soil and then also keeps the lightweight inoculant in place. And work has also been done to gauge the effectiveness of adding borders around the inoculant. And mostly this has involved adding borders of straw. And this has been really effective when restoring larger areas, but maybe not as helpful with smaller experimental plots, but I think this is very promising. And then I think we've seen the highest success by adding jute ground cloth. So in addition to stabilizing soil and holding the inoculant in place, jute also provides a nicer microhabitat for biocrest growth. So here's an example of how that looked in an experiment of my own. We added salvaged biocrest fragments to jute ground cloth, and we found that the biocrest first grew like under the jute ground cloth and then filled in the interspaces of the jute. And we were able to get biocrest moss and lichen to reestablish at about 40% cover within 4 years. Salvaging biocrest is certainly the way to go if possible, because it cuts down on the time needed to cultivate biocrests. And there's some amazing collaborations I've heard about forming on the Colorado Plateau between land managers and biocrest researchers that have literally resulted in storage units full of tons of biocrest inoculant that has been salvaged and is going to be used for restoration. And so I'm sure with time, these same sorts of collaborations could be developed more broadly. That said, there's been a lot of work to develop new methods for cultivating biocrest for restoration and even scaling up the production of biocrest for larger restoration efforts. So it's really shocking because they're so burly and they grow so well outside in harsh conditions, but biocrests grow much quicker in greenhouses where they can be pampered. And so we see a lot of success when growing them under being misted in big tubs like this. But one of my favorite methods is this rack of burlap shelves that rotate to kind of maximize the amount of biocrest that can be grown vertically in a greenhouse setting. And so the idea is then these burlap sheets can be set outside and the burlap slowly disintegrates and then biocrest can establish much quicker. And I expect to see a lot more progress on this front in the next few years. So once added, the survival of the biocrest inoculum seems to depend on its adaptation to field conditions. Now, despite the resilience, as I said, of biocrest organisms, once they're harvested, their viability does start to decrease over time. So you may have heard, it's one of my favorite little bits of biology, of mosses that have been stored in herbaria for over 100 years, and you add water and they regrow. But those mosses are not regrowing at the vigor that we want and need for restoration. And so recent work suggests that the best regeneration occurs from biocrests that are stored dry in the dark and used within a year. So there may be an ideal shelf life for storing our salvaged biocrest. And then when we think about greenhouse cultivated biocrests, they face a unique challenge of being adapted to this pampered environment that's very different from the harsh environment that we want to plant them into. And so strategies to facilitate their survival after transplanting have involved hardening the inoculum. And this is usually a stepwise preconditioning strategy of exposure to higher UV and repeated dry wet cycles. Alternately, or even additionally, you can soften the environment you're planting them into. And so you could add water and shade outside, and this can help improve survival, at least in some cases. And finally, one other thing to consider when it comes to inoculum survival is competition with plants, and in particular, invasive plants. When we're talking about really degraded places, this is a real concern. And with the study I mentioned earlier, we hand weeded every few weeks. That's incredibly time consuming and not realistic on a large scale. But our recent results suggesting that herbicides may not impact biocrests in this system are an exciting next step, and we need to see if that pattern holds for biocrests that are in the early stages of regeneration. And that could be a really helpful and necessary tool to use for biocrest restoration at a larger scale. And finally, most of this work by necessity has been done on very tiny experimental plots. And what we need now are methods that scale up the production, reduce the cost, and treat very large areas that are of ecological and management relevance. And it would also be great if these methods took advantage of equipment that was already developed for other restoration purposes. And this is where those salvaged biocrests really start to make a lot of sense, since growing the amount of biocrest in a greenhouse with the methods we currently have is really limiting. So in terms of scaling up biocrest application for restoration, some recent efforts have included adding biocrest fragments through a seed drill, or adding them to areas that were first imprinted with that tractor attachment that imprint soil. And both of these strategies really were just trying to ensure that biocrest fragments were in direct contact with soil and that they could be applied much quicker. And so out of these two methods, the imprinting strategy seems to be the most promising way of scaling up the application of biocrest inoculum. The one thing that hasn't been tried with moss or lichen, it has been tried with cyanobacteria and does seem promising, is hydroseeding. And so now that we have ideas on salvaging, how we can salvage or grow biocrest inoculum, and we know which tackifiers can be helpful. We also even know that hydroseeding, even when we're not adding biocrest mosses, does promote moss growth, but this is like over the decade scale. So I think adding biocrest inoculum and tackifiers to a hydroseeding treatment could be very promising. And there's even been some recent work of growing mosses in bioreactors, which if those could be hardened and then blended into a puree, could provide these vats of liquid inoculum. That's my wish. I'm hoping to see something like that happen soon. I'd love to be a part of it. And so I think this is a particularly exciting time to be working on biocrest restoration. It really is a global effort right now that's moving slowly at the pace of biocrest growth, but we've started to see some really big successes. And so if this is interesting to you and you want to know more, I'd urge you to check out this online and freely available biocrest restoration manual. I'll put the link in chat when I'm done in just a second. It is focused on the Colorado Plateau, but a lot of this information will be relevant to other places. And so lastly, I promised I wanted to take a few seconds to show you some pretty photos so that you can go find some biocrest when all the snow melts. I would say that biocrest mosses can be some of the easiest to overlook when they're dry. They kind of look a lot like plant debris or even dirt. They're just brown and crusty. And so the best time to see them is when they're green and hydrated. You kind of just see these bright green places along the landscape around grasses. In northwestern Montana, we have about 30 species of biocrest mosses in our grasslands. Some of them are not brown when they dry out. So as you can see, hopefully on this photo on the left, some green dried biocrest mosses, so keep your eye out for those. And then on the photo on the right, these mosses, when they dry out, turn kind of red, and their leaves are much thicker and very succulent. And they could even be confused with a vascular plant or a succulent, but they don't have roots. And so that's one way to tell the difference. And then with lichen, you would expect to see foliose lichen like this. And sometimes they can be buried beneath plant litter and harder to see, but other times they'll be exposed on the soil surface like this. You'll also find crustose lichen, and this is probably the most diverse group of lichen. Oh, and I wanted to point out that lichen diversity in the Montana grasslands, just so you have a reference, was 3 times higher than moss diversity. So there's a lot more many more types of lichen to find when you're searching. And so in this photo here, there are at least 4 different types of crustose lichen, which are spectacularly beautiful. And finally, I want to make sure it's clear that all of these organisms will be growing together. So here we have some crustose lichen, some dry moss, and some foliose lichen, all within centimeters of each other. And so with that, I'm happy to take questions, and I'm going to place this link for this manual in chat for you.
That was awesome, Mandy. Thank you so much. It's so nice to see the ground. It's snowing here, so we haven't seen the ground in a long time, but it's nice to see them in pictures. So our first question is from John. He says, you mentioned that tall grass prairies do not have biocrests. Is there anything we can do as restorationists to facilitate them in this ecosystem? And would there be a benefit in that?
John, that's an excellent question. And I want to start by saying I have never been in a tall grass prairie. Everything I know about tall grass prairies is from what I've read. And what I've learned throughout my life is that people don't see biocrest. They don't see mosses and they don't see lichen unless that's their passion. And so what I've read is that because the plant cover is so dense and there's not enough light getting through and there's thicker amounts of plant litter, that does not promote biocrest growth. So it may not be a good environment for them. But I also don't know. I'll often be out in the field and digging through plant litter, and I find biocrest there. They're doing just fine. And so I would have to say I don't have a good answer for you, but it's mainly because I don't even know if they're there. And so I think that's something that needs to be looked at further.
Okay, thank you. May has a question. She says, interesting that your herbicide research turned up no effect. In your understanding of herbicide effects on lichens and mosses, do you consider the modes of action, each of which disrupts specific processes within plants? Like, do lichens and mosses have similar internal processes that would make them susceptible to vascular plant herbicides?
That is an excellent question. I think that's where that research needs to go next, because I don't have good answers for you at all. I think that, so there's been a fair, maybe let's say a small body of work that's looked at mosses or lichen outside of drylands. And I'd say the results are all over the place, but everyone's applying these herbicides differently. you know, a lot of times they don't have a control. And so it's really kind of hard to pull apart the information and understand what's happening with these different types of herbicides. And so but then inside the moss and lichen, there's similar and there's different processes. And I was really surprised by what we found. Personally, I'm kind of I don't want to use herbicides person. But as I'm doing more restoration, they're really, really essential, I'm finding, and especially for restoring biocrust. So as my whole perception is changing, I think the importance of this is increasing in my playbook. And so I think where you're asking, like understanding these different modes of actions is a really important next step.
Thank you. The next question is from Jessica. In the eastern part of Montana, I hear club moss getting a bad rap. It is believed that to have taken over and crowded out the native grasses and forbs. Others say that it isn't something to be concerned with since it is native. What is your take on what club moss plays? Can it get out of control or is it misunderstood?
First, I think club moss is actually a vascular plant. So I'm going to put that out there. We're not going to blame it on the mosses. But I don't know anything about this research. And so I don't have a good answer for you there either. I would say that the debate on when natives outcompete natives and if that's good or bad is a really intense one that I don't have a good answer for. I think it would have to come down, and I think this is how we need to start managing our ecosystems, to what our goal is for that ecosystem. You know, so I guess I can't say either is bad. I'm sorry. I don't think I've had an answer yet. I'm doing a bad job here.
So the next one is from Thuy Doan. Since biocrusts have seed capturing ability, how is the potential of reintroducing biocrusts into mixed grass areas where both native and exotic invasives coexist?
Yeah, that's a mixed bag, isn't it? Because you don't want to capture the invasive seeds. So maybe this is where the herbicide starts to come in and you start to mix strategies. I do think that one thing we haven't done with biocrust direct reestablishment is to integrate them into like not totally disturbed ecosystems, you know, that are just bare ground. And so something like what you're talking about, mixed grass areas with both types of natives and exotic species, I think that biocrust would probably restore a lot faster. And so maybe adding biocrust inoculant in there with some well-placed herbicides would be the way to go. But that's a wide open area. Yay, all these questions.
Here's another one. Stephanie asks, I was wondering if you could share your thoughts around Alan Savory's claim that biocrusts are the cancer of desertification. Do you feel that this claim has had a detrimental impact on the public perception of biocrusts?
I am so glad you brought that to my attention. I didn't keep making it through the Savory book. I made it partially and then gave up. So I didn't know he said that, and that's a bummer. I think that they probably weren't aware of the work on their ecological impacts of biocrust. And so I'm sure that has had a detrimental effect on public perception of biocrust. I feel like there's a really strong contingent of scientists that are focused on changing public perception of biocrust in like the Colorado Plateau area. And even worldwide, there's a big effort. Like biocrusts are getting a lot of hype now, and it's really exciting. But I think that next step of communicating the importance of biocrust to the public is where we need to go next. And people are amazed when you show them biocrust. And like I've worked with ranchers, and I can do experiments on their property, and we can see that where the biocrusts are, the invaders don't come, and they buy in really heavy on that. That's an easy sell. So I think, yeah, the word's not going to come to me, but that's something we as scientists really need to sell.
Thank you for that answer. Our next question is from Michael. Once it eventually becomes available commercially, are there any concerns with sourcing biocrust far away from the restoration site, and how important is geographical proximity?
That's a great question. I think we don't know, but I think that's an exciting future area of work. I was just reading, oh, his name's not going to come to me, but the idea of restoration. So thinking ahead for what the environmental conditions will be and starting to use, plants or biocrests that might be better in future conditions. And so this may be a very important point, that we may need to start using biocrest communities from more arid conditions and moving them and seeing how they do. I know there's some work in progress on that, but I don't think they have any results yet.
Okay, thank you. Our next question is from Kristen. What advice do you have for increasing the shelf life of biocrests? I am working on a project where we have salvaged biocrest and are storing it in a cool, dry warehouse. But construction will not be complete in 1 year, and we will need to store for probably a few years.
I think that you will have lower, I'm so excited about your project, by the way. I wish I could know more, but I think your shelf life will decrease some, but I think you're probably going to be okay. I've done a lot of growing biocrest mosses in particular, that have been in bags for quite a few years, and I think the difference between 1, 3, 5 years, there's a difference, but it's a bigger difference with like 5, 10, 20 years. So I don't think you should do anything different than what you're doing. I think you should keep them in your cool, dry warehouse. That would be my guess.
Perfect. John has another question. Restoration sites often have large amounts of bare soil for a number of years after seeding. Would these areas benefit from application of biocrest inoculants?
Yeah, I think that this is the prime site for this. And what I'd love to see is more like when even in Montana, when we have bare soil and we have spotted knapweed coming in, at the base of spotted knapweed is all biocrest mosses. I think someone asked earlier too, they're seeing mosses like in the tallgrass prairie. Is that a biocrest? And this kind of goes together. What we're finding is that we're kind of changing our definition of what we call biocrest. And so when mosses or lichen are kind of integrating that soil surface, we're really starting to call them biocrests, even if previously we might have just called them mosses. And so it's the same thing, but this is how our verbiage is changing.
Okay. We have an anonymous question. Will passing restoration occur of biocrests if a field that has been cropped for 30 years is seeded to perennial forages? And if so, how long will it take for any biocrests to establish?
I would expect you would start to see the biocrests come in, and I would expect, in your system, the mosses coming in first, and within 10 years, you'd probably see them. And if they're not being outcompeted by the invaders, even sooner, you'll start to see traces of mosses within a few years. In Montana, the lichen are the late successional biocrest community, and it takes 30 to 50 years from what we know, maybe to get to those like really licheny, beautiful biocrests.
Awesome. So we have 2 questions that are similar. What types of herbicide did you use?
Yeah, I'm gonna have to look back at my slides. I used Plateau, Esplanade, and Perspective. And I should have added the name of what the actual substance was, and I apologize. And then I used for the surfactant Superb. But I can put this is the chat, my email address, if I can type in chat, and please do get in touch if you want to know more and I can give you more details.
Perfect. We have one more question, or we have time for one more question. So this is from Rhonda, if one was to propagate and establish biocrest in other areas, what depth do you bury, and is it best to surface apply the dried biomass? And so there's another one that's also asking if you have any experience using a seed drill versus.
Yeah, you definitely want to put them on the surface. If you cover them with soil, they will not grow. So that's where I would suggest thinking about one of these tackifiers. So mixing it with, when I apply them with water, for one, that helps it adhere to the soil right away, adding some jute ground cloth to kind of keep it on there. Oh man, I forgot the second question. Seed drill.
Using a seed drill, yeah.
Seed drill,
So,
yeah. So I was presenting some work. There's one recent study where they applied BioCrest with a seed drill. They made these like BioCrest cookies that were applied, and just the seed drill itself tended to bury those BioCrest cookies, and so that didn't work too well. It worked a lot better with the imprinting that just kind of roughed up the ground surface, and then they added BioCrest to that.
Great. Well, you have been a wealth of knowledge about BioCrest. So this has been really awesome. I kind of wish we had more time. So thank you. And you put your email address in the chat. So if anyone wants to contact Mandy and talk more about BioCrests, you're welcome to.
I would love that.
There's also a question about like ID, like what resources you use to ID. If you wanted to throw that in the chat as well. Okay. Or if you want to send it to me, I can put it in like the feed loop chat, and then I'll stay there for a few months.
Yeah, I will do that.
Perfect. So thank you so much, Mandy. That was awesome. And thank you to our attendees for joining the soil session today. So we covered an agricultural perspective, an industrial perspective, and one from like a general soil or general restoration perspective, which is kind of why they weren't really connected, but we just covered all those areas in our soil morning. So next on our schedule is the trade show and designated poster session and lunch. So the case studies will start at 1:20 this afternoon, and you have a choice of 2 case studies today. So we'll see you around the virtual platform and this afternoon. Have a good lunch.